Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning. Story 1. The Long Walk to Water, Surviving the Empty Quarter. You are standing on the edge of the Rub al-Khali, known more widely as the Empty Quarter, the largest uninterrupted sand desert in the world. It stretches across the southern Arabian Peninsula, touching Saudi Arabia, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. For centuries, its harshness has been legendary, a place where few survived unless they carried generations of knowledge in their bones. The Bedouin did. This section begins with a walk, not a symbolic one, but a literal one. A tribal caravan from the early 19th century, most likely from the Al-Murra or Rashid tribes, sets out across the dunes. The journey is not romantic. It is one of function, need, and obligation. There is no water where they are, and rumors of a distant well have reached the sheik. Such decisions are not made lightly. Walking into the Rub al-Khali is like sailing off the edge of a known world. Yet they go, not for conquest, not for riches, but simply to survive. The desert clock, time measured in shadows and stomachs. You are told they walk by stars, but that's only half true. The older men know the rhythms of the sun, the feel of sand underfoot, the shift in wind that tells you morning is near. The stars help only when the sky is clear, and when the night is not so cold that your teeth chatter too loud to think. But the real clock is in the stomach. Camels must feed and people must drink. The Bedouin walk not by the hour, but by when the animals begin to falter. When their legs wobble, when they refuse to rise, you know you've pushed too far. The desert teaches you this lesson once. After that, you remember. Camels, the silent heroes of the sand. The dromedary camel is not merely transport. It is water. It is milk. It is warmth on cold nights and the smell of home in a foreign place. Every Bedouin child learns the parts of the camel like a scholar learns scripture. A limp, a wheeze, or a mischew of the cud could mean death. In 1812, a caravan attempted to cross from Liwa to Wadi Hadramaut, a journey of over 500 kilometers. The sheik in charge, Salim bin Dakhil, recorded in oral memory that 2 camels died on the first day, not from thirst, but from overfeeding before the trip. Their bodies could not handle the sudden effort. Such mistakes are the luxury of the inexperienced. The decision to leave, when staying, is more dangerous. Most outsiders imagine nomadic Bedouins constantly on the move. This is incorrect. Movement is costly. Every journey is a gamble on health, weather, tribal politics, and the reliability of the guides. In this story, the decision to leave was made after the 3rd child in the camp fell ill from waterborne disease. The well was going brackish. That happens sometimes. Deep aquifers shift, especially after a dry winter. The elders argued for days. Eventually, the youngest of them, a man barely into his 30s, pointed to the sky. There are no birds. That was enough. Birds meant insects, which meant water. No birds meant the well was dying. And so they packed everything: tents, goats, dates, sacks of barley, flint stones, a few curved knives, and 3 hand-stitched water skins. One was already half empty. Bedouin maps were not on paper. To read the desert, you must memorize it. The shape of a dune, the smell of the air at night, the echo of a call against a rock outcrop, these are your coordinates. In a world where sand shifts and landmarks vanish with wind, the only reliable map is the one in your mind. There are stories of men who could lead a caravan blindfolded for half a day. Whether this is true or not is irrelevant. What matters is that navigation was a sacred trust. The lead guide on this particular journey was an elder named Gasson. He carried no tools, only a crooked walking stick and a pouch of dried lemons for the heat. His map was the feel of the wind and the shape of the stars in the western sky. And he walked always 10 paces ahead, speaking to no one, listening to the desert. Sleeping in sandstorms and other uncomfortable truths. You may wonder, How do you sleep when sand cuts your skin? The answer is badly. Tents are flattened during major sandstorms. Blankets are soaked in camel urine, a known repellent for certain desert pests, and wrapped tight. People sleep in fetal positions, backs to the wind, faces buried into whatever cloth they own. Children are bundled between adults for warmth and security. Snakes and scorpions often enter tents but rarely strike unless disturbed. The biggest danger during sleep, however, is the cold. Desert nights fall to near freezing. Without firewood, which is scarce, the only option is body heat. Sleep is a luxury. You rest lightly between dangers. When water is found, it is not always a gift. After 4 days, the caravan finds a well. But here is where romanticism ends again. The well is old, from an abandoned station of the incense trade route. The water is alkaline, foul-smelling. One camel drinks and vomits. But the Bedouins have no choice. They filter what they can through cloth, boil what they must, and offer the least to the youngest. The old drink last. There is no celebration, only silence as each person quietly weighs how long this supply might last. The next leg of the journey is harder. They know it. The heat will rise, the nights will be shorter, and the dunes less forgiving. But the desert doesn't care. And that is the first survival lesson the empty quarter teaches. The land owes you nothing, and so you owe everything to each other. Unresolved thought to end section 1. As the caravan pushes deeper into the Rub al-Khali, sand rising like waves around them, you begin to wonder. What happens when the desert changes its mind, and your guide is no longer certain of the way? You find yourself in the 3rd week of the caravan's journey, somewhere between the bones of dried wadis and the distant mirage of a half-remembered spring. The camels are slower now, and the air has changed. It no longer smells like sand. It smells like old stones, sunburned for centuries. Ghassan, the lead guide, begins to hesitate. Not openly, not with words, but you notice he checks the sky more often. His pauses at the crest of dunes are longer. He circles back in the evening to recheck the tracks, though no one speaks of it. In the world of the Bedouin, doubt is rarely voiced aloud, but it lives in the silence between steps, and it's in that silence that the desert begins to test the memory of its travelers. The vanishing path, sand as an unfaithful guide. Unlike rock or earth, sand remembers nothing. The path walked yesterday will be gone by sunrise. Winds change the shape of the land overnight. You cannot leave markings, signs, or permanent trails. The dunes, like the desert itself, are indifferent. Here, the caravan must rely on Fi letter 1E6DR, of the instinct born from repetition. Yet even instinct can falter when the land reshapes itself without warning. One night, Ghassan quietly admits to the sheik that he no longer recognizes the contours of the ridge they passed at dawn. He suspects they may have veered north, drawn by the slope of the land and the deceptive play of light. The sheik says nothing, simply adjusts his headscarf and walks away. To speak of being lost is dangerous. It spreads through the camp like a scent. Animals sense it. So do children. And fear in the desert is a kind of poison. How the Bedouin measured distances without numbers. In modern terms, this journey might be tracked by kilometers, GPS, or satellite imagery. But to the Bedouin of the 19th century, distances were measured differently. They used days but not standard days. They'd say 4 days if the camels are well fed, or 2 days if the wind is with you. These estimates factored in terrain, weather, mood of the herd, and tribal boundaries. The current route was believed to be 7 easy days. They were now into their 12th, with half their water gone and no confirmed well ahead. Still, no one spoke of turning back, not because of bravery, but because there was simply nothing to return to. The poisoned well, the empty camp, the birds that never came. Forward was survival, backward was slow death. The fireless meals, eating without fuel. At night, food is scarce, and there is no wood to burn. What little dried brushwood they had gathered early in the journey is long gone. Cooking is replaced by soaking. Dried lentils are soaked in any water available, often barely potable, and eaten cold. Salted camel jerky is cut thin and chewed slowly over hours. Dates are shared sparingly, their sugar hoarded like treasure. One woman in the group, Faisal, is renowned for her desert bread. But without fire, she improvises. She flattens the dough and places it beneath her sleeping mat at night, letting body heat and sun-baked sand leaven it just enough to eat the next day. It tastes of sweat and survival. And yet, in the morning, it's the only thing that makes the children smile. The sacredness of water. Water in the desert is not just a resource, it is a spiritual thing. You learn watching the caravan that every drop is ritualized. No one drinks alone. The cup, usually a small tin bowl, is passed from eldest to youngest. The camels are watered before the people. There is no gulping, only sipping. The phrase, "May your thirst be eased," is said before each drink, not as a politeness but as a prayer. On the 13th night, a sandstorm arrives. It strips the skin. Visibility drops to zero. Tents are collapsed not out of fear but strategy. A standing tent can become a kite in a gale. When the storm ends, 3 waterskins have torn. One is lost entirely. No one cries. There is no room for crying. The body cannot afford it. Tribal boundaries, invisible lines that decide life or death. As they move forward, they enter territory claimed by another tribe, likely the Bani Khalid or remnants of the Harb. Bedouin lands are not marked by signs, but everyone knows where they begin and end. To trespass without permission is a dangerous act. So the caravan adjusts course subtly, not too far to avoid conflict entirely, but enough to show deference. They light no fires, raise no songs, and pass without complaint. The tribes of the desert, despite their distance, maintain a network of reputation. A group that disrespects a boundary may find no one willing to help them in the future. Survival is not just about the land, it's about honor. When the animals speak first. By the 15th day, the camels begin to show signs of dehydration. Their humps shrink not from loss of water but loss of fat. One collapses mid-step. The sheik orders a halt. To lighten the load, the tribe begins leaving items behind. Extra blankets, a broken saddle, a rusted cooking pot, even a scroll of poetry written in ink long faded. These are not decisions made lightly. Each item is a part of someone's history, but the desert has no use for sentiment. You learn that the true cost of survival is memory. The well that wasn't, a lesson in desert lies. On the 16th day, a young scout barely 13 returns with excitement. He claims to have found signs of water, birds nesting in an acacia tree, damp sand at the base of a dune. Hope surges. The group changes direction. 2 hours, then 3. At last they reach the spot. It is a false signal. The dampness is leftover from a rare fog. The birds are migratory and feed elsewhere. There is no water here. The boy does not speak for the rest of the day. He feels the weight of trust betrayed. But no one punishes him. Mistakes are part of the desert's teaching, and this land teaches hard. What does it mean to be lost without admitting it? That night, Gasson walks alone to the top of a dune and stares at the stars for a long time. When he returns, he tells the sheik that he believes they are 2 days from the next known well if they can hold course. If, he says, not with confidence but with fatigue. That if is the heaviest word spoken in days. And yet, they prepare to walk again at first light. Unresolved thought to end section 2. The group marches in silence, shadows stretching across the dunes like fatting memories. You begin to wonder. What if the well is dry or worse, claimed? What happens when survival depends not just on nature, but on the mercy of strangers? It is the 18th day. The desert is quiet in a way that feels less like peace and more like forgetting. It is as though the land no longer knows the presence of these people, this thin line of camels, walkers, and silent children strung out across the dunes like thread on sand. This section, the last in this journey, follows what happened next. The story is not heroic in the way that fills poems. No battles were won, no great cities reached, but in the world of the Bedouin, there is perhaps no greater story than this. We walked into the worst place on earth, and we came out alive. When hope is smaller than a waterskin, the caravan's remaining water is gone by mid-morning. They do not panic. Bedouins have long known that panic dries the body faster than heat. They chew date pits to keep the mouth wet. They tie cloth over their faces to recycle breath. One man whispers a verse from the Quran. Another recites lines of pre-Islamic poetry about rain, not out of belief, but because repetition offers rhythm, and rhythm becomes motion. They move slower now. The camels are almost skeletal but still upright. This is the point in the journey where the idea of rescue disappears. No one is coming. No caravan, no patrol, no cloud. The only path is forward. A stranger's tent in the distance. Late that afternoon, a boy spots movement in the distance, what might be the white flutter of a bait shower, a black and white goat hair tent. At first, many believe it to be Sarab, a mirage, but Gasson confirms it. Smoke from a cooking fire, the tracks of goats, the faint trace of human scent in the air. It is a Bedouin outpost, belonging, as it turns out, to a small branch of the Bani Yas traders from the south, wintering in this marginal corner of the Rub al-Khali. Cousins, technically, or enemies, depending on which story is told. The sheik of the caravan instructs everyone to stop just out of sight. He, Gasson, and one other approach the tent. This is Sul al-Arab, the old custom. No group walks unannounced into another's land. The water that was shared and the kind that was. They are received by an elder woman named Sayyida bint Amir. Her tent is modest. Her sons are away, likely herding. She recognizes the sheik and Gasson by name and does not ask questions. Instead, she offers laban, salted camel milk, an offering not just of hospitality, but of status. Then she directs them to the Al-Jub, a deep stone well dug generations ago, and still fed by a hidden aquifer. There is water, cool, bitter, life-saving. But it is not free. Sayyida reminds them gently that this land is under Kisma, tribal division. Any use of resources must be balanced later. She offers water for one night and the next day, but says more must be negotiated when her sons return. The sheik agrees. In the desert, no one is too proud to beg for life. Rest is not the end. The group sets up a temporary camp nearby, under low trees whose names even Gasson does not know. The children bathe in shallow pans for the first time in weeks. Camels are rubbed down with oil. Wounds are cleaned. Blankets are shaken of sand. And yet this is not a true return to comfort. They are not home. They are still in dangerous land. They are still strangers. Survival is not a moment. It is a process. An agreement at sunrise. At dawn, Sayyida's eldest son arrives, Hamid, a man with a knife on one hip and a flute on the other. He listens to their story, then calls his brothers. A majlis, a sitting, is held under a tamarisk tree. There is no shouting, only quiet tones, questions asked once and answered once. The water is granted for a further 5 days. In exchange, the caravan will leave a young camel as payment to be bred into the Bani Yas herd. No paper is signed, no hand is shaken. But when the sheik says, "We drink with your name," Hamid nods. That is enough. Leaving with less, but not empty-handed. On the 21st day, the caravan resumes its journey, veering west now, toward Wadi Hadramaut. They carry less than they arrived, with fewer camels, no surplus supplies, and many are ill from sunstroke. But they carry knowledge. The boy who mistook the signs of a false well is now apprenticed to gasson. The women have developed new ways to preserve dates. A teenage girl has memorized the star paths by night, surprising even the sheik with her observations. And everyone, every single person knows that they have seen the worst the desert could offer. And they endured. How survival becomes culture. This is how Bedouin knowledge passes on, not in books, not in schools, but through suffering remembered, shared in quiet retellings under tents. The mistakes, the storms, the false paths, and real water, they become part of the tribe's inherited story. And over generations, those stories become law. This is why, in the 20th century, when British cartographers came to map the Rub al-Khali, they found the Bedouin already had it memorized, not in drawings but in recitations that could go on for days. The desert, they said, was not empty, it was just secret. And if you listened closely, it would tell you where to walk. Final reflection, what we learned from walking through silence. You began this story on the edge of the empty quarter, watching a people walk into uncertainty. Now, you understand what carried them through. Not luck, not bravery, but memory passed down in verse and voice. Community, where survival meant shared loss and shared gain. Humility, in the face of a land too vast to be conquered. The survival of Bedouin tribes is not a miracle. It is the slow, persistent knowledge of how not to die, refined through centuries, whispered through generations. And as the caravan disappears into the west, you're left wondering. In our modern age, surrounded by tools, technology, and certainty, have we forgotten how to survive without them? Story 2. The Camel Masters of Sinai. You find yourself beneath the rust-colored cliffs of the Sinai Peninsula, where the wind moves through narrow wadis and goat bells echo through the heat. The Bedouin who live here, primarily from the Jabaliya and Muzana tribes, do not speak of conquering the land. They speak of coexisting with it. This is not the wide, rolling desert of the empty quarter. Sinai is jagged, ancient, and carved by wind, water, and time. It is a place of silence and stone, and here the camel is not just a beast of burden. It is a vessel of memory. This story begins not with movement, but with preparation, a slow, meticulous ritual of readiness that defined the way the camel masters of Sinai survived, traded, and traveled across one of the most unforgiving peninsulas on Earth. The camel as a cultural engine. The Bedouin of Sinai refer to camels with terms more intimate than ownership. Each camel has a name. Each is remembered for its temperament, its endurance, and its maternal lineage. Bloodlines are traced with as much care as royalty. A well-bred female camel can feed a household, carry trade goods across borders, and survive on saltbush and thorn scrub for weeks. Unlike the Arabian camel of the empty quarter, the Sinai camel is leaner, more angular, and adapted to mountainous terrain. These camels are not for show. They are workers, and their training begins early, first with smell and sound, then with burden and balance. The camel is not just transport, it is identity. How mountains shape people. In the Sinai, survival is vertical. Movement is measured not in distance but in altitude. The Bedouin carve steps into rock with their sandals. Water is not found in wells but in seasonal pools, hidden in granite bowls and crevices. You learn to move not toward where the sun is but where it was. That's where the shadows hide the rain. The terrain dictates everything. Homes are built low, stones stacked with almost no mortar. Tents are used only seasonally. The people here do not wander for the sake of wandering. Each journey has a purpose, usually trade, diplomacy, or pilgrimage. Camels cannot be overburdened in these mountains. A misstep on shale could mean a shattered leg. So the camel masters weigh everything. Dates, salt, incense, even fabrics are apportioned precisely. Nothing more than what the mountain allows. The forgotten trade, salt, soot, and prayer beads. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, Bedouin tribes of Sinai controlled critical microtrade routes, not large caravans like the famous spice roads, but smaller, essential pathways that connected the monastery at St. Catherine to Red Sea ports, and further to Upper Egypt and the Hejaz. They traded salt harvested from the dried beds of the Gulf of Aqaba, charcoal burned from twisted acacia and carried in goatskin sacks, beads carved from desert stones and sold to pilgrims as talismans, goat wool, hand-spun and dyed with crushed beetles and pomegranate rind. These were not wealth-building trades. They were sustaining trades enough to feed a family, to exchange for medicine or dates, to keep relationships with lowland tribes strong. To outsiders, these trades seemed trivial, but to the Bedouin, they were the veins of life. The camel trials, a harsh test of endurance. Every 3 years, the Muzana held a camel endurance trial. Not a race. That would be wasteful. The trial tested stamina over 10 days. Navigating narrow mountain passes without command. Surviving on saltbush and brackish water. Withstanding the mountain cold, yes. Sinai grows cold at night, bitterly so. Camels that passed the trial were marked with a small scar at the base of the neck, painful, yes, but a badge of honor. Those who failed were traded to lowlanders or sent to graze indefinitely. The best camels were kept in oral genealogy, with their names passed on to grandchildren. One famous female Najma, meaning star, was said to have made the trip to Mecca and back 7 times in her life. Women and the economics of survival. Bedouin women in Sinai held a different kind of power. While they rarely led caravans, they were the makers of goods. They spun wool, prepared dried foods, and crafted saddle padding from goat hair. They taught the young camels to accept the scent and presence of humans. One elder, Fatima al-Jabaliya, was known to carry a flint stone and a worn parchment listing debts owed in salt and lentils. She served as a kind of tribal accountant, her tent doubling as a ledger. Trade depended on trust, and trust in Sinai often rested in the hands of the women who remembered what others forgot. The monastery and the camel path. St. Catherine's Monastery, founded in the 6th century, was not just a religious site. It was a hub of exchange between Christian monks and Muslim Bedouin. For centuries, the monks relied on camel caravans to bring supplies, letters, and ink from the coasts. In return, the Bedouin received flour, glass bottles, and on rare occasions, books. The monks respected the Bedouin, not because they had to, but because they shared something sacred, knowledge of the land. The camel path was the narrow route between the monastery and the northern wadis. It wound through passes so narrow that a loaded camel had to walk sideways. Many fell, but still the trade endured, because it was the only route known to connect these two worlds. And it was held in the memories of a handful of men and the temper of the camels they trained. The dangers not spoken. There were dangers in these mountains. Flash floods which could come even in dry seasons, funneled by stone. Tribal feuds, sometimes generations old, over access to a single grazing ridge. Wild dogs, lean and fast, that targeted newborn camels. Cold, sharper than steel, that split lips and froze hands overnight. But most dangerous of all was overconfidence. Sinai punished those who moved too quickly, carried too much, or forgot that every path here was a privilege, not a right. To survive, you had to move with humility, and you had to trust your camel more than yourself. Unresolved thought to end Section 1. One day, a young camel handler, barely 17, is tasked with leading a supply caravan through a lesser-known pass to the monastery. It's an honor and a test. But no one has walked that route in over 10 years. And as he takes his first step into the narrowing path, you begin to wonder. What happens when the mountain remembers a danger that no one else does? Would you like to continue to Section 2 of Story 2? Continue. Story 2, The Camel Masters of Sinai. Section 2. The Narrow Pass and the Young Handler. The boy's name is Tariq. He is not yet a man by Bedouin standards. His voice still cracks when he speaks loudly, and the blade at his waist is more ceremonial than functional. But he walks with the confidence of one born beside camels, and in this moment he is the guide. Ahead of him lies the Siket al-Gamada, the path of the hidden. It is narrow, winding, and long unused. His grandfather remembers it from his youth, but only vaguely. The trail has not been tested in over a decade. Still, the elders decided the time had come to revive the old way. The monastery at St. Catherine needed supplies before the winter. The usual routes were blocked by a rockfall. So the young boy was given 3 camels, 5 sacks of barley, a tin of olive oil, parchment scrolls sealed in goatskin, and a string of prayer beads for the monks. And then they said Bismillah and watched him disappear into the folds of the mountain. What camels remember when people forget. One of the camels, an older female named Zara, had walked the trail once, many years ago. It is said camels remember routes the way others remember smells or dreams, abstract but vivid when reawakened. Tariq walks at Zara's side, hand on her halter, not leading so much as accompanying. When the trail narrows to single file, Zara takes the lead. You begin to see how trust is built in the desert, not through dominance but through partnership. Bedouins never beat their camels unnecessarily. Training is based on habit, rhythm, and voice tone. The camel responds to stress, to subtle shifts in breathing. Together, they move forward, man and animal, apprentice and veteran, through a trail that has become more memory than road. The tools of desert travel that aren't just tools. Tariq carries few tools. A leather pouch with crushed thyme and salt for wounds. A flint stone, used not just for fire but for signaling. A waterskin made of goat hide, lined with charcoal. A staff not for walking, but for balance on steep rock. And a song passed down by his grandmother, used to calm animals and himself. The real tools, though, are in his eyes and ears. He listens for falling rock, watches the shadow angles to track time, and feels for vibration beneath his feet, early warnings of a possible landslide or unseen stream. The Bedouin do not need maps here. They need memory, rhythm, and patience. The pass tightens, when even camels must kneel. Midway through the second day, the trail tightens. The sandstone walls lean inward. Tariq must unload the packs and have the camels kneel, inching forward in turns. In such moments, a pause is necessary, not to rest, but to think. He checks each load, redistributes the weight, and rubs the camel's knees with oil from his pouch. This is not kindness, it is strategy. A bleeding knee could slow the group and mean failure, and in the mountains, failure comes quietly. No vultures circle overhead. The rocks simply cover your story. Here, movement is slow. In 6 hours, they cover only 1 kilometer. But they do not stop, because the rule of the mountains is simple. If you stop, the cold will come. And cold is the desert's second death after thirst. Night in the cleft. That night, Tariq sleeps wedged between 2 boulders, shielded from the wind. The camels lie down behind him, their bodies heat engines in the open dark. He ties their legs, gently, not to prevent escape, but to keep them from wandering into a crevasse in the dark. Dinner is dried figs and goat cheese wrapped in cloth. He drinks little, speaks even less, and watches the stars for reassurance. Here in the ancient sky over Sinai, the stars are not just decoration. They are calendar, compass, and company. His grandfather taught him the name Suhail Altair, the nail of the southern sky. But the one he watches most is Sirius, the leader of the sky. It is said that when Sirius is high, the trail is safe, and tonight it burns bright above the rocks. Morning brings a test. At dawn, they reach the shoulder of the pass, the narrowest stretch. A ridge only 2 meters wide with a drop on both sides. Tariq walks first, coaxing the camels with clicks of the tongue and soft whistles. Zara follows without hesitation. The other two pause, balk, then eventually follow. It takes 3 hours to cross 30 meters. Not because of danger, but because of discipline. One misplaced hoof, one slipped stone, and all is lost. This is where the young prove themselves. Not by speed, but by control. Not by shouts, but by silence. A message for the monks. As the path widens, Tariq sees the top of the monastery wall in the distance. A small stone tower, smoke rising from a chimney. He smiles briefly. But tradition demands he not approach directly. Instead, he circles to the Bedouin gate, a low entrance known only to locals, used for centuries. There he dismounts. He sings the arrival call, a slow, ascending chant meant to announce peaceful approach. A monk appears on the wall, nods, then disappears. Within the hour, a side gate opens. Tariq leads the camels inside. He is offered bread, olives, warm water scented with herbs. No questions, no praise. Only this. You walked the Sikhet al-Gamida, the monk says. Tariq nods. No one has done so since before the big rains. The exchange is quiet. The scrolls are delivered. The supplies, mostly for winter preparations, are unloaded. In return, the monks give a sack of flour, a tiny copper oil lamp, and a tattered book of herbal drawings. Tariq asks if the book is for trade. The monk shakes his head. It is for learning, he says. Use it well. No coin is exchanged. In Sinai, knowledge is currency, and the price of the trail has already been paid in sweat and silence. The return is never the same. Though Tariq takes the same path back, it is not the same journey. The pass has changed. Stones have shifted. A small spring he missed before now bubbles beneath an outcrop. The wind has changed direction. The camels are more tired, more wary. He moves slower now, not because of doubt, but because of respect. No path in Sinai is permanent, and the boy who entered it is no longer quite the same. Unresolved thought to end section 2. As Tariq and Zara descend toward the southern ridge, the sun setting behind them, you begin to ask, how many paths of survival do we forget simply because no one is left to walk them again? The journey back to Tariq's camp is slower than his departure. The trail, now familiar, no longer rushes him forward. Each step is an echo of the step before. The wind carves the cliffs as it always has. The stones shift in their endless rearrangement, and Zara walks with her steady grace, ever in front. But though the path is known, the return is never simply a reversal. In Sinai, nothing stays the same, not even the rocks. The desert is subtle, but relentless in its change, and the survival of the camel masters depends on their ability to notice what others forget. This final section explores what comes after the successful journey, the passing of knowledge, the rituals that preserve it, and the quiet resilience that endures beyond maps or fame. Arrival without applause. When Tariq returns to camp, there are no cheers, no celebration, only quiet nods and a single cup of sweetened tea from his grandmother, placed in his hands without a word. This is the way of the Bedouin. Survival is not glorified, it is expected. The elders listen to his report. He speaks plainly, listing only the facts: weather, rock conditions, camel behavior, signs of water, signs of danger. He does not exaggerate, and no one asks for drama. What matters is the record. The sheikh, a stooped man who once crossed the Sinai 5 times in a single year, simply says, "You remembered the steps. That is enough." Recording memory without paper. You might imagine that journeys like this would be written down. But in Sinai, oral record-keeping remains the core tradition. After sunset, Tariq is invited to recite his route to the elders and the younger boys. He speaks it as a kind of poem, half instruction, half storytelling. 3 steps beyond the olive rock. Then left where the lizard runs. The shadow touches the pass at mid-morning. Sing to the wind before the second climb. This is how memory survives in the mountains, not through letters but rhythm. The trails are taught like songs, to be memorized, then passed down by tongue and tune. To forget a verse is to lose the way. The camels are treated first. Before Tariq rests, the camels are washed and rubbed with oil. Zara, the lead, is given fresh water mixed with crushed dates, a reward earned not just for survival, but for guidance. Camels, especially lead females, are seen almost as spiritual partners in Sinai. They are mourned when they die. Their hair is sometimes braided into talismans, and if they've led a tribe through hardship, their names are sung long after. Zara, after this journey, will not be ridden again. She will graze freely. Her offspring will be trained as leaders. This is the unspoken contract, service repaid with peace. When mountains decide who may stay. That winter, the monastery sends word. Another caravan is needed, but storms have blocked the high pass. Several young men volunteer, eager to prove themselves as Tariq had. But the sheikh says no. The mountain allowed one path this year. That is enough. In Sinai, there is a deep belief that the land has memory. Paths opened once may not open again for years or ever. To assume otherwise is arrogance. The sheikh instead sends a trade message to the coast and tells the monks to wait. Patience is also survival. Lessons in the unchanging rock. Tariq, in the weeks that follow, becomes an informal guide. He leads the younger boys through local wadis, teaches them to listen to their camels' footsteps, and shows them how to judge the age of a trail by the type of dung on it. He never boasts, he doesn't need to. He simply teaches what the rocks taught him. One evening, as they sit on a ridge overlooking the Red Sea, a younger boy asks, "What if we forget these paths? What if no one walks them again?" Tariq looks out and says, "The mountain will still be here, but the safe way through it, that depends on us." The hidden language of the camel masters. The title Camel Master is not officially given. There are no ceremonies, no marks, only behavior. A true master knows when to trust the animal's instinct over their own. Can pack a camel in silence and unload it in a storm. Understands that speed is enemy, not ally in the desert. Teaches without pride, the very skills that may one day save their student's life. In time, others begin referring to Tariq as a Rakib letter 1E25, a Qi Macron, a true writer. But he does not call himself that. Instead, he says, "Zara showed me the way, I only listened." Why the world forgot the camel masters. Today, few remember the significance of the camel routes of Sinai. Highways cut through the old wadis. Plastic water bottles and GPS have replaced wells and stars. Tourists take photos of Bedouin men in traditional garb, not realizing that each calloused hand once carried history, not just heritage. But the knowledge isn't gone. It waits in the hum of an old trail song, in the pattern of hoofprints across basalt stone, in the pause before a camel moves forward without command. It waits, patient as Zara on the trail, for someone to ask the way again. Final reflection. Survival without legacy is disappearance. The camel masters of Sinai never sought monuments. Their survival depended not on being remembered, but on remembering. And perhaps that is the final survival lesson from the mountains. The land doesn't need your memory to exist, but you need its memory to survive. So you ask yourself, in a world that celebrates speed, efficiency, and noise, what quiet knowledge are we forgetting to carry forward? Story 3. Sword, Salt, and Sand, Bedouin Trade Routes. You stand at the edge of an ancient trail, one not marked on modern maps. The sand stretches out before you in waves, but buried beneath its surface lies a forgotten artery of commerce, movement, and quiet power, the Bedouin trade routes. Long before paved highways, shipping lanes, or national borders, The desert was crisscrossed by invisible paths carved into memory. These were not grand silk roads filled with caravans of silk and spices. These were quieter, leaner, more vital. And the ones who held these roads were not kings or empires. They were the Bedouin. This story begins not in a city, but in the middle of nowhere, a stretch of arid space between the Hijaz Mountains and the heart of the Arabian desert. A small band of riders emerges from a mirage, their camels heavy with leather sacks and bundles wrapped in palm fiber. They are not lost, they are merchants. Trade as survival, not wealth. Unlike the grand market traders of Cairo or Damascus, Bedouin merchants did not amass vast fortunes. Their trade was shaped not by luxury, but by necessity. They carried salt cut from dry lake beds and packed into blocks, dried meat, especially from gazelle or camel, swords and daggers, often crafted with simple but durable steel, medicinal herbs such as frankincense, myrrh, and desert wormwood, animal skins, used for water storage or crude shelter. News, whispered from tribe to tribe, arguably the most valuable of all. This wasn't glamorous commerce. It was quiet bartering between nomadic tribes, oasis settlements, and wandering pilgrims. One item might pass through 10 hands before reaching its final home. The route without a road. The Bedouin rarely followed fixed roads. Instead, they used a network of shifting trails dictated by seasonal water availability, political alliances, tribal conflicts, weather and sand dune migration. Some paths were wide and worn, while others were barely distinguishable from wilderness. A common route might stretch from Al-Hassa to Mecca, then onward to Al-Ula or down to the Hadramaut region. And yet they navigated without compasses or maps. Instead, they followed star alignments, animal behavior, wind direction, the taste of sand. Yes, the taste. Bedouin guides could distinguish regions by the fine texture and salt content of the dust. Guardians of the road. The Bedouin tribes were not just users of these trade routes. They were guardians of them. Control of a particular passage meant power not over land but over movement. And in the desert, movement was life. Tribes like the Bani Harb, Anaza, and Shamar controlled key corridors. They levied informal tolls in the form of protection agreements, offering safe passage in exchange for goods or loyalty. But unlike cities with walls and armies, these tolls were enforced through reputation and retaliation. A tribe known for betrayal would find its neighbors unwilling to trade. A caravan attacked unjustly could trigger a tribal feud lasting generations. Thus, survival along the trade routes depended not just on knowledge, but on diplomacy. The salt that bought a treaty. In 1748, an often overlooked agreement was struck between two rival tribes in central Arabia, the Bani Khalid and a smaller nomadic group whose name is lost to history. The dispute, access to a salt flat during the dry season. A 3-day negotiation under the shadow of an acacia tree ended in an unusual compromise, a rotating system where each tribe had exclusive access to the salt bed every other lunar cycle. In return, each would escort the other's trade caravans during their respective off weeks. This was more than a treaty. It was an acknowledgement that in the desert, cooperation was sometimes more profitable than conquest. And all of it hinged on salt, that dullest, yet most vital of commodities. Weapons in the pack. You might expect that traders in such dangerous conditions would travel armed, and they did. But the swords and daggers they carried were more symbolic than strategic. A typical Bedouin caravan sword was short, curved, and well-worn, often passed down for generations. More importantly, they traveled with alliances, armed escorts from allied tribes, cousins married into distant clans, or spiritual protection through shared beliefs. Actual battles along trade routes were rare. The risk of escalation was too high. Instead, conflict was managed with posture showing readiness, not aggression. The real strength of a caravan lay not in its weapons, but in its relationships. The unsung role of women in trade. Although rarely seen leading caravans, Bedouin women were integral to trade. They processed and preserved food for long travel. They sewed the woven bags that held valuable goods. They prepared medicinal mixtures from desert herbs. They managed negotiations within domestic spaces during intertribal visits. And most importantly, they maintained oral histories knowing which tribe could be trusted, who owed debts, and what promises had been broken. Trade was not just movement of goods, it was memory, and women, especially elder women, were often its keepers. A caravan in the wind. One story passed down through Bedouin oral tradition tells of a merchant named Salih al-Daban, who led a small caravan from Najd to the southern Hijaz during the early 1800s. Halfway through the journey, a sandstorm struck. Visibility dropped to nothing. The camels panicked. The men grew disoriented. But Salih had memorized the Song of the Stones, a traditional navigation chant that described the feel of the earth underfoot in different regions. He had his men walk barefoot, yes, barefoot until the heat and texture of the ground told him where they were. They made it through. To outsiders it was madness. To Bedouins it was method. Trade as storytelling. Each exchange along the Bedouin routes was more than economic. It was social. Every trade was a retelling of identity, a way to show where you came from, who you trusted, and what your tribe valued. A sword wrapped in blue wool might say, "I am from the north." A bag of dates marked with burnt sigils meant, "This belongs to a healer." A belt with worn silver coins stitched into it whispered, "My tribe once traded with the Yemenis." The trade routes were not roads. They were languages made of footsteps, goods, and gestures. Unresolved thought to end section 1. As the caravan disappears beyond the next dune, their silhouettes swallowed by wind and light, you begin to wonder. What happens to a people when the roads they remember are erased not by enemies, but by time itself? The trail continues, though the footprints do not. In the vastness of the Arabian interior, a caravan rarely leaves permanent marks. Even the ruts left by camels are swept away by the desert's breath before nightfall. But what endures are the relationships, reputations, and rituals that define the Bedouin's role in trade. This section follows one particular route, the trail from Al-Hassa in the east to Mecca in the west, a vital artery connecting the Persian Gulf with the holy cities. Through it passed not just goods, but gossip, obligations, warnings, and survival itself. The road was never straight, and never the same twice. Why the route mattered more than the destination. Trade in the desert is often misunderstood. To many, it seems a dangerous and inefficient method of commerce. Why carry small loads for long distances under punishing heat? But for the Bedouin, the goal was never to dominate trade. It was to sustain mobility. By moving between oases, towns, and sacred sites, Bedouin tribes preserved autonomy. They did not rely on cities. In fact, many avoided them. Instead, their power lay in controlling the connectors, not the hubs. The Al-Hassa, Mecca route was valuable because it passed through neutral tribal lands, where diplomacy held sway. It had access to seasonal wells and underground springs. It provided an alternative to Ottoman-controlled routes. It allowed discreet trade in goods deemed sensitive, like weapons or religious texts. And most of all, it was flexible. If a section became unsafe, the path bent. Like the dunes, the Bedouin knew, rigidity breaks, flexibility survives. Trade as trust, the handshake before the sand. Before a caravan began, a ritual took place, the pledge of Safa, or purity. This wasn't religious, but practical. The sheik of the tribe organizing the caravan would meet with allies and neutral parties to declare the cargo and its ownership, the intended direction and stopping points, the escorting tribes responsible for each leg, the agreed-upon shares in case of sale or spoil. Nothing was written down. The agreements were sealed in memory, sometimes witnessed by elders or marked by symbolic gestures, sharing coffee, slitting the palm and pressing hands, or reciting lines of mutual ancestry. Betrayal of such a pledge did not result in lawsuits. It resulted in blood feuds, some lasting generations. The invisible currency, honor, obligation, and oaths. It's hard to understand how trade could function without receipts, signatures, or collateral. But in Bedouin culture, reputation was currency. If a tribe was known to lie, cheat, or steal, no one would trade with them. Worse, others might align against them. Trust was so embedded that a merchant might hand over goods worth a year's income to a cousin in another tribe, without proof of the agreement, because to break it would dishonor entire bloodlines. Such systems are fragile in large societies. But among the nomads of Arabia, where a man's word could mean survival or starvation, truth was not virtue, it was necessity. Water and trade, the hidden tax. The real cost of desert trade wasn't camels or time, it was water. Water determined the size, speed, and spacing of every caravan. One hidden spring known only to a single tribe could make the difference between profit and ruin. Some Bedouin became water brokers, charging for access to wells, not the water itself, but the right to stop. In one recorded oral account from the early 1800s, a trade caravan from Cadiz attempted to bypass a toll by using a lesser-known spring. The route was longer, the water brackish. By the time they reached their destination, 2 camels were lost, and the dates they carried had fermented in the heat. The lesson passed down. A cheap path can cost the most. The woman who owned the salt. Among the Bedouin of northern Arabia, a woman known as Salim, mother of Salim, managed a salt trading operation for nearly 20 years. Though rarely seen at caravan camps, her name was well known. She operated from a tent near a seasonal salt flat, managing laborers and pack animals. But her true influence came from her network of kinship debt. Every major caravan had at some point borrowed or bought salt from her. She did not charge interest. She remembered who owed her and when. No one dared cheat her. Her records were carried in the minds of her nephews, who served as her messengers. When she died, 4 tribes sent representatives to her funeral. Not for grief but for balance. They came to pay their final debts. When trade routes became highways for ideas. Beyond goods, Bedouin trade routes carried something far more influential: thought. News of distant rulers. Religious debates. Techniques for treating camel diseases. Herbal knowledge from Yemen. Political gossip from the Hijaz. And stories, endless stories. One such story tells of a man from the Anaza tribe who traded a single ivory comb from East Africa for 12 goats, a bolt of dyed cotton, and a prayer mat. The mat, it said, was stitched with a rare verse unknown in that region. The mat sparked theological debate for weeks. Eventually, it was gifted to a traveling scholar who wrote a treatise based on the verse's interpretation. Thus, a simple item of trade transformed into religious scholarship. That is the unseen power of these routes. Ideas moved faster than goods. The collapse of the quiet roads. By the early 20th century, as trains and cars replaced camels, many of these trade routes vanished. Some were erased by war, others by borders. Some simply fell into disuse as people moved to cities. But a few remain not in maps, but in songs sung by old men beside campfires. Songs that speak of shaded wells, stubborn camels, and silver coins that changed hands under a date palm tree no longer standing. Unresolved thought to end section 2. As the stars rise and the winds smooth over yet another day's footprints, you begin to wonder. In a world where every transaction is tracked, timed, and taxed, what have we lost by forgetting how to trade on trust alone? The sun has set over the shifting dunes and the desert is cold again. The trade caravan, its camels resting and its goods stacked neatly in bundles, settles into silence. The men sip warm milk, chew on dried dates, and speak little. You're at the end of the trail now, though there is no signpost, no gate, no border to cross. Just the knowledge that this is where the trade was meant to end. But Bedouin trade was never truly about endpoints. In this final section, we will look at what happened after the goods changed hands, how trade shaped alliances, sparked conflict, preserved knowledge, and wove together a culture that, while often described as simple, was anything but. The final deal, trade as ceremony. When a caravan reached its destination, perhaps Mecca or Medina or a remote oasis, it did not immediately unload. Instead, there was ritual. First, the host tribe would meet the caravan outside the settlement with food and drink, not out of charity but out of tradition. You did not negotiate on an empty stomach. To do so was considered insulting, as though you were desperate. Then came the sitting, rugs laid out, tea poured, hands rinsed with water scented with herbs. Only after this would the bargaining begin. The goods were examined, weights were guessed by hand, quality was judged not by certificates but by smell, texture, and taste. And if a deal was struck, it ended with the oldest form of agreement in Bedouin life. La Berkat Allah, in the blessing of God. Goods that traveled farther than people. Some of the goods exchanged on these trade routes traveled farther than the traders themselves ever would. A blade forged in Oman might end up in the saddlebag of a Syrian horseman. Salt blocks from the rub, Al-Khali could season food in a Turkish coastal town. Myrrh gathered near Najran could find its way into the incense burners of Ethiopian churches. A camel pelt tanned in Tabuk might become a rug in a Sufi lodge in Sudan. The traders didn't track these outcomes, but they knew that their cargo lived new lives elsewhere, and that was enough. Because for the Bedouin, survival wasn't about ownership. It was about circulation. When trade failed, the quiet violence of missteps. Not every caravan reached its end. There are countless oral accounts of failed trade journeys. Tribes who misread the weather and lost their camels to thirst. Negotiations that broke down due to perceived insults, sparking armed standoffs. Deals sabotaged by rumors, the deadliest weapon in a reputation-based economy. Entire trade seasons ruined by a single sick animal infecting the herd. Yet the most dangerous form of failure was ignorance. A young trader who forgot a name, mispronounced a tribal ancestor, or stepped into a sacred space without invitation could doom his entire caravan. The Bedouin had no written law for such missteps. They didn't need one. Because in a culture built on memory, every mistake was recorded in the minds of men and remembered for generations. The children who watched and learned. At every trade stop, children watched. They were rarely involved, but always present. They listened as prices were named, as hands gestured over leather and wool, as voices grew louder or softer depending on whether the deal was close or collapsing. They watched how goods were handled, how a cracked bowl might still be sold if the story around it was persuasive enough. They memorized the weight of silence, knowing when not to interrupt, when to offer tea, and when to disappear. By the time a boy was 12, he knew how to evaluate a camel's health. By 15, he could smell bad flour. By 17, he could lead his own pack if the elders trusted him. And the girls, they memorized even more. Because they managed what came after the deal, the household economy, the allocation of trade goods, and the maintenance of long-term debts across families. In a culture without ledgers, Memory was the economy. When the roads became stories. By the mid-1900s, formal Bedouin trade caravans began to disappear. Motor vehicles, national borders, oil wealth, and modern infrastructure made long desert treks obsolete. Many of the routes were paved over, others vanished completely. But something unusual happened. The stories remained. Old men still sit by fires in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the Sinai, retelling tales of the salt route, the trail of the white rock, or the pass where the camel wept. These are not fairy tales. They are maps of memory. And they are told not to entertain but to instruct. Because though the road is gone, the survival knowledge still matters. How to bargain without offense. How to gauge trust without documents. How to carry only what is needed and nothing more. How to recognize that nothing is truly yours unless it can be carried, shared, or remembered. The Bedouin legacy in modern trade. Today, international trade moves at light speed. Spreadsheets track every coin. Artificial intelligence forecasts markets. Satellites monitor cargo ships. And yet, when crisis strikes, when systems fail, ports close, or routes collapse, it is the old lessons that resurface. Trust in people, not platforms. The value of adaptability. The power of reputation. The knowledge that no system lasts forever, but principles can. You can still find echoes of Bedouin trade logic in modern souk bargaining, in nomadic digital communities, even in emergency logistics in conflict zones. Their roads may be dust, but their ideas live on. Final reflection: why forgotten roads matter. So you sit at the edge of the firelight, listening to the end of the story. The desert stretches out into darkness, silent, soft, and unknowable. You understand now that Bedouin trade was never about riches. It was about rhythm. A rhythm of trust, necessity, movement, and memory. And the sword in the saddlebag. The salt in the bundle. The words unspoken in the deal. They mattered because they were part of a system built not on power but on patience. And so you ask yourself, in the rush to modernity, what ancient rhythms have we silenced that once taught us how to survive together, in motion, under the same sky? Story 4. The Quiet Siege of Man, Bedouins, and the Ottoman Railroads. You stand at the edge of the Hejaz Railway, watching the line stretch through the dust of southern Jordan. Steel rails run east of the sandstone hills, slicing a quiet wound into the desert. It is the year 1910, and the Ottoman Empire is building. But something in the air is uneasy. To the Bedouin tribes near the small, sun-baked town of Man, the railway is more than a marvel. It is an intrusion. The trains bring pilgrims, soldiers, goods, and taxes. They also bring new rules that do not consult the sand, the camel, or the sheik. This is the story of how a town, a railway, and the surrounding tribes entered into a strange standoff, not with bullets and banners, but with silence, sabotage, and survival. Not all sieges are loud. Some are quiet, patient, almost invisible. Man before the tracks. Before the railway, Man was a modest way station, a place of wells, shaded by palms, guarded by the Huwaitat and Bani Adiya tribes. Pilgrims from Damascus passed through here on foot or camel, bound for Mecca. Trade caravans stopped to resupply. Water and rest were Man's main currency. It wasn't rich, but it was respected. Its survival depended on its neutrality. No major tribe claimed it completely, but many protected it loosely. It was a place where truce was assumed, even if not declared. That balance began to shift in 1908, when Ottoman engineers arrived with iron rails, telegraph wires, and a new kind of law. The arrival of the Hejaz Railway. The Hejaz Railway was designed to modernize pilgrimage routes and tighten imperial control over distant provinces. Its path cut through tribal lands long ruled not by documents, but by custom, and consensus. To the Ottomans, this was progress. To the Bedouin, it was a challenge to sovereignty. The line reached Man in 1909, along with a small military outpost and a telegraph station. The town changed overnight. Camel trade declined. Ottoman soldiers monitored local markets. Taxes were enforced on livestock herds. Arms were restricted. Local disputes once settled by tribal judges were redirected to imperial courts. No battles broke out, no revolts were declared. But something else happened. The Bedouin began to withdraw. Withdrawal as resistance. Unlike urban revolts or peasant uprisings, Bedouin resistance didn't involve barricades. They simply stopped cooperating. Caravans rerouted around Man, favoring longer, safer paths through tribal territories. Water rights were disputed, then denied to Ottoman surveyors. Camels disappeared when officials came to requisition them. Messages were delayed, and telegraph wires quietly clipped in the night. When supplies were sent by train, the final mile often went mysteriously missing. This wasn't declared warfare, it was a siege of inconvenience. The town could not function without local cooperation, and the locals knew it. The secret economy in the shadow of the tracks. As the Ottomans tightened control, a shadow economy emerged. Goods once taxed in Man were instead exchanged in nearby wadis. Tribes like the Sakher and Bani Khalid organized temporary markets a few miles from the rail line, accessible to trusted travelers, invisible to imperial patrols. This system was maintained not with maps, but with song codes and trusted names. A traveler might ask, "Where does the date tree bloom?" and receive the answer, "Only where the goat walks backward." It sounds poetic, but it's a code, a direction, a timeline, a warning. In this way, the Bedouin preserved autonomy not by attacking, but by avoiding. Bedouin versus telegraph, the war of wires. Among the many changes brought by the railway, the telegraph was the most resented. It replaced the oral messenger, a time-honored role in Bedouin life. These messengers, called kufaf, had carried tribal letters, oaths, and declarations for generations. They knew every trail, every family name, every feud. Now the Ottomans preferred wires and stations. So the kufaf retaliated not with violence, but with deliberate errors. Messages were mistranslated. Directions were reversed. Delivery times doubled. And when these tricks didn't suffice, wires were cut not all at once, but methodically. A single cut between two posts, a delay in repairs, then another miles down the line. The Ottoman station commander called it ghost sabotage. He was not wrong. Inside the Ottoman garrison, misunderstanding the desert. The Ottoman presence in Man was modest. A few dozen soldiers, an officer, and a rotating group of engineers and surveyors. Their reports show deep confusion about local behavior. Why do tribes refuse wages for helping build the railway? Why do they not want free travel on the train? Why are they polite in person, but non-compliant in action? The answer was simple but unspoken. The Bedouin did not see the Ottomans as enemies, but they did not see them as legitimate rulers either. To them, the desert had no need for an empire. The camel that knew the railway schedule. One of the quiet legends told by the older camel handlers was of a camel named Sabhin, who grazed near the tracks and memorized the sound of the evening train. Each day at dusk, when the whistle blew, Sabhin would rise, walk to the edge of the line, and stand silently as it passed, then return to grazing. Some say Sabhin was trained. Others say the camel simply observed enough times to know the pattern. But to the Bedouin, Sabhin became a symbol. Even the camel watches the train, but refuses to follow it. Unresolved thought to end Section 1. As the whistle of the Ottoman train fades into the horizon and the silence of the desert returns, you begin to ask, what happens when progress arrives uninvited, and those who know the land simply refuse to follow where it leads? It is 1911. The Hijaz Railway continues south from Man toward Medina. Ottoman engineers are busy extending the tracks, hammering steel and stringing telegraph lines through the desert. The empire is proud. The Sultan speaks of progress. The press in Constantinople calls it a civilizational artery. But outside the small garrison at Man, the desert remains unimpressed. The Bedouins still ride without permission, still guide pilgrims away from the rail line, still trade in the open dunes rather than under station walls. The siege of Man continues not in gunfire, but in abstention, avoidance, and attrition. This section explores the slow escalation of tension. The Ottomans built their railway to bring control to the desert, but the desert, unwritten, unmapped, and unruled, began to unravel their plans. Empire and sand, a fundamental misreading. To understand the standoff at Man, you must understand what the Ottomans misunderstood. They believed that infrastructure was influence. They assumed that tribes would follow economic incentives. They viewed the desert as a void to be filled, not a landscape already governed. But Bedouin society wasn't static or disorganized. It was highly adaptive, rooted in negotiated balance, and wary of any power not earned through honor or exchange. To impose rules on such a system, without consultation, was seen as not just arrogant but dangerous. As one oral history from the Huaytat tribe puts it, the train came like a knife that had never shared our bread. The disappearing pilgrims. One of the primary goals of the Hijaz Railway was to transport pilgrims from Damascus to Medina, and it worked on paper. But in Man, something strange happened. Many pilgrims disembarked early, choosing to travel the remaining distance on camelback. Why? Some feared tribal ambushes. Others had heard the water on the train was bad. Many believed the pilgrimage required hardship, and the train was too easy. Most importantly, local guides encouraged it. Bedouin guides offered protection, tradition, and storytelling. The journey became a spiritual rite again, rather than a state-controlled commute. The Ottomans saw this as regression. The Bedouins saw it as preservation. Sabotage by timing. While full-scale sabotage was rare in Man, the tribes perfected a more subtle tactic: temporal disruption. Wells along the route were declared impure during train days. Caravans crossing tracks would pause midline, forcing trains to wait. Messages requesting repairs or supplies would be delayed until after prayer. Entire sections of track would mysteriously flood despite no recent rain. Ottoman officials grew suspicious but found no open hostility. The people were always respectful, always compliant in speech, but somehow the trains never ran on time. It was death by inconvenience. A market just out of reach. Outside Man, less than 2 kilometers from the station, a Bedouin souk sprang up every Thursday. It was not illegal. It sold nothing explicitly banned, but it operated outside the Ottoman tax authority. Merchants arrived at dawn. Blankets were laid on the ground. Goods were displayed: salt, camel milk, wool, medicinal herbs, even charms made from fossilized shells. And the Ottomans, they watched from afar. Every time they tried to formalize it, the market would vanish disassembled in minutes. When guards were sent to patrol the area, the merchants simply moved again to a new patch of desert, known only to those invited. It was resistance by ephemeral commerce. Tribes as a network, not a threat. The Ottomans often viewed the tribes near Man as isolated units, but in reality, they were part of a loose but responsive network stretching from the Levant to the Hijaz. If one group was harassed or under pressure, Word spread faster than any telegraph. A single water rights dispute in Man could affect trade in Alula. A tax quarrel with the Bani Adiya could lead to unexpected rockslides on rail segments hundreds of kilometers away. The tribes had no central leadership, but they had mutual interest. And the railway had interrupted the one thing that guaranteed safe passage: consent. The quiet collapse of a station's purpose. By late 1911, the Man station was fully built. Barracks, a telegraph room, water towers, warehouses, an administrator's office. But it was nearly empty. Goods arrived, but few were moved. Pilgrims stopped there but didn't stay. The soldiers grew restless. Some deserted, others bribed locals for companionship. The telegraph wires hummed, but the messages had grown routine and meaningless. The station commander, in a now-lost report, allegedly wrote, "We have built a road into sand. The sand is winning." The Bedouin memory of Man. In later decades, the story of Man became a parable among the Bedouin. Not of battle, but of balance. They said, "The train brought noise. We answered with silence. They came to move us. We stayed and watched them pass. The tracks lie still, but we are still walking." Man never exploded into rebellion, but neither did it submit. It became a kind of mirror reflecting the limits of control and the resilience of a people who understood that to live in the desert, you must outlast, not outrun. Unresolved thought to end Section 2. As the train sits idle at the Man station, its engine cold and its cargo untouched, you begin to ask, what if resistance doesn't need to shout, march, or fight? What if it only needs to refuse to move? It is 1914. The Ottoman Empire is at war. The Hijaz Railway, once hailed as a technological triumph, has become a vulnerability stretching hundreds of kilometers through lands it never truly claimed. The quiet resistance around Man has evolved. What began as non-cooperation and passive disruption has given way to something more coordinated, more strategic, and still somehow entirely rooted in silence. No revolution was declared, no battles officially recorded. And yet within just a few years, the rail line at Man would be largely abandoned. The station would crumble, the tracks would rust beneath blowing dust, and the Bedouin, they would remain. This final section explores how a people with no standing army, no state, and no written manifesto slowly reclaimed their space not by force, but by simply outlasting an empire. World War I reaches the sand. With the outbreak of World War I, the Ottoman Empire found itself struggling to maintain its distant provinces. Troops were needed elsewhere. Supplies ran thin. Communication broke down. Man, once envisioned as a hub, became a liability. Telegraph lines were cut more frequently. Entire rail cars vanished between stations. Ottoman soldiers found themselves increasingly reliant on local guides they could not control. Caravans refused to support troop movements without triple payment or simply left. The desert had become a place of whispers again. The Bedouin networks, fluid and informal, began to align not through ideology, but through opportunity. And that opportunity soon arrived in the form of Lawrence of Arabia. When outsiders finally listened, T.E. Lawrence, a British officer fluent in Arabic and better attuned to tribal diplomacy than most, understood a key fact. Control of the Hijaz Railway didn't mean controlling the desert. It meant defending every mile of it, and that was impossible. He didn't try. Instead, he coordinated with local tribes, including many around Man, to disable the railway not through full battles, but through targeted, symbolic sabotage. Small groups would remove a section of track at night, set charges on empty supply cars, block key sidings with boulders or felled palms, attack only when success was certain, then vanish. The desert absorbed them. The Ottomans couldn't respond fast enough. The Bedouin didn't need to win territory. They just needed to make the railway irrelevant. The last train south. According to Bedouin oral accounts, the final train to pass Man without damage ran in late 1917. After that, the line became unpredictable. Some trains turned back mid-journey. Others were rerouted entirely. The Ottomans prioritized lines closer to Damascus and Medina. Eventually, Man's station was quiet again, but this time truly empty. Not from defeat, from irrelevance. A kind of victory more enduring than conquest. The camels returned to the rails. As Ottoman control waned, the Bedouin returned to the roots around Man, not as rebels, but as themselves. Camel caravans reclaimed the old paths. The souks returned, nearer to town now but still untaxed. The station was repurposed, its stones used for homes, its water towers shared freely. Children climbed the dead trains and played on the rails. No war memorials were built, no songs of battle were sung, but the community remembered what was lost and what returned. Man went back to what it had been before the tracks came. A meeting place, a well, a story told in many directions. Legacy in dust. Today, the remnants of the Hejaz Railway near Man still exist, quiet, oxidized bones scattered across the desert. Travelers walk beside rusted rails. Tourists photograph derelict stations. Historians speak of the rise and fall of Ottoman logistics. But for the Bedouin, the story remains simpler. The tracks were never theirs. The train never brought them closer to each other. And the land, when left alone, remembers its people. Some descendants of those tribes still live near Man. They know the stories not from textbooks, but from fireside memories, half-sung poems, and the way their grandparents pause when they talk about the station. Final reflection: what the desert teaches about endurance. In the end, the siege of Man was not won with violence. It was won with consistency. A refusal to be rushed. A preference for memory over machinery. A belief that power which doesn't understand the land will pass through, but not stay. This story reminds you that resistance need not be loud. That sometimes, to survive, one must simply outlast the noise. And so you sit in the shadow of a crumbling train car, letting the wind pass through its windows like a forgotten song, and ask, in a world addicted to movement, what strength lies in simply remaining still? Story 5. Under the tent, Bedouin codes of honor and survival. You are seated beneath a black goat hair tent, open on one side to the horizon, anchored with rocks, its canvas whispering in the desert breeze. This is not a shelter of luxury, it is a framework of survival. It is the early 19th century, somewhere on the edge of the Nejd. The air is dry, the food simple, and the rules, though unwritten, are absolute. Here, under the tent, the Bedouin code of honor, or muruwa, lives not as law but as atmosphere. It governs speech, shapes hospitality, settles feuds, and protects the weakest. It is not enforced with weapons. It is enforced with memory and reputation. This story does not follow a war or a journey. It follows a way of being. It is the story of how, in a land without prisons, police, or courthouses, the Bedouin created one of the strictest codes of honor in the world, and how survival depended not on strength, but on the ability to be trusted. The tent as a symbol, not a shelter. The Bedouin tent, called the Beit al-2BFR, House of Hair, was more than cloth and poles. It was a declaration. Its open side faced the direction of guests. It was divided into two sides, one for men and guests, majlis, one for women and family, harem. It could be packed in under an hour and carried by 2 camels. And it could become a court, a sanctuary, or a battlefield of words. When you crossed into someone's tent, you entered their honor. And that meant you were protected. Letter 1E25 I am a Macron YH. Protection as sacred duty. One of the most powerful Bedouin customs was letter 1E25 I am a Macron Y. A H the obligation to protect a guest, even at the risk of one's own life. If a stranger entered a tent and touched the central pole or uttered the phrase on a dakilak, I am under your protection, the host was bound to defend them. No questions, no judgments. Even if the stranger was a known criminal, even if they had killed the host's kin, once protection was requested, it had to be honored. Failure to do so would shame the entire tribe. It sounds extreme, but in a lawless land, trust was the only law, and hospitality was its most sacred expression. Al-Jar, the protected neighbor. A jar, a protected neighbor, was someone living under a tribe's authority but not of it. Perhaps a traveler, a poor herder, or a widowed woman with no male kin. To harm a jar was to declare enmity against the tribe itself. Stories are told of warriors who refused to avenge a blood feud because their enemy had taken shelter as a jar. To violate that protection was to make oneself an outcast, no longer welcome in any tent. In a land where movement and alliance meant survival, to be cast out was worse than death. Blood feuds and the calculus of revenge. While the Bedouin prized hospitality, they also practiced blood vengeance, or thair, with intense loyalty. If a man was killed, his kin were obligated to avenge him even years later, but the system had rules. Only the killer, or a direct male relative, could be targeted. Killing innocents was dishonorable. If the killer entered another tent and was protected, vengeance had to wait. Compensation, or diya, could be offered often in the form of camels or sheep. In some cases, poetry was used to negotiate peace. Yes, poetry. A well-spoken shair, tribal poet, could shame or persuade a tribe into accepting a truce. Words, spoken in rhythm, held power. Because to break a word was to sever one's place in society. The power of the spoken promise. There was no ink, no seal, no document in most Bedouin agreements. Only this, actum 2YW, a letter 2BF, a DT. I have stepped forward and promised. And that was enough. A man's word once given was a public currency. Others remembered it, elders tracked it, and failure to uphold it could result in exclusion from markets, denial of marriage alliances, lack of support in feuds, loss of rights to water and grazing. Without a written legal system, social consequence was everything. Letter 2BF IRD, the weight of family honor. Among the most sensitive aspects of Bedouin honor was letter 2BF IRD, the reputation and purity of the family, especially of its women. To insult someone's letter 2BF IRD, even through implication, was to trigger a blood feud. Bedouin women were often strong, outspoken, and respected. They ran tents, managed herds, and shaped tribal politics through marriage and mediation, but their public honor had to be protected at all costs. There's a story of a man who killed his cousin over a joke told in poor taste about a woman's veil. No one questioned it. The honor of the family demanded redress. In a world without walls, reputation was the only barrier. The outcast, when honor is broken. When a man failed in his obligations, lied, betrayed a guest, broke a vow, he could be declared mafquid al-thika, lost trust. This was not a formal exile. It was worse. It was being ignored. No one offered water. No one greeted him. His name was not spoken. His stories were not repeated. His children could not marry. It was a slow social death. The desert would not kill him. His absence from memory would. Unresolved thought to end section 1. As you sit under the tent, watching the fire burn low and the stars stretch across the endless sky, you begin to ask, In a world where contracts are signed and rules written down, what do we lose when we no longer value a promise made by hand and witnessed by silence? Morning light filters through the woven tent walls. Smoke rises from a fire pit where coffee simmers in a blackened pot. The desert is calm, but never still. Around you, the quiet continues, interrupted only by the soft clinking of camel bells and the slow rhythm of movement in camp. But beneath the surface of this tranquil routine lies a precise and demanding system of behavior, one that decides not just who survives but who belongs. In this section, we continue exploring the intricate, often misunderstood moral architecture of Bedouin society, how trust is built, broken, and rebuilt, how justice is negotiated in the absence of prisons, and how honor survives even when nothing else does. Al-Naqwa, standing for others. One of the most revered traits in Bedouin life is Naqwa, the instinctive readiness to support, protect, or avenge someone without being asked. It is different from duty. It is spontaneous, often risky, and defines what kind of man or tribe you are. Examples of Naqwa: riding out to defend a distant cousin during a tribal dispute, even when your tribe isn't involved. Hosting a starving traveler during a famine, using your last sack of dates. Publicly vouching for a man's word when his reputation is questioned, staking your own in the process. To show Naqwa is to build respect that transcends bloodlines. To fail in Naqwa is to be remembered for cowardice long after you're gone. Calm, more than a tribe, a moral circle. Western observers often mistranslated calm as tribe. But the word is deeper than lineage. A calm is a people bound not just by ancestry, but by shared values, speech patterns, poetry, and behavior. A moral community where every action reflects not only on the individual, but the entire group. The living memory of your elders, ancestors, and future descendants. When someone breaks a code, fails to avenge, shelters a thief, or slanders without cause, the shame doesn't belong to him alone. It belongs to the calm. That is why disputes are handled with negotiation, apology, and restitution, not because conflict is feared, but because the reputation of the whole is always at stake. When an apology is not just words. In Bedouin society, to apologize is not humiliation, it is a skill. A proper apology is poetic, precise, and public. One form of apology involves a delegation of elders, sometimes bringing symbolic items. A sheepskin signifying humility. A white cloth signifying peace. A flagon of water representing purity of intention. They recite lineage, history, and poetry, and then they offer the apology. We come not with our heads low, but with our hands open. What was taken was not ours to take. Let the flame die with us, not grow among you. This isn't theater, it's survival. Because reconciliation ensures the calm continues. The Shair, poet as judge, memory, and weapon. The tribal poet or Shair was not just a bard, he was a negotiator, a historian, a satirist, a defender of honor, and in some cases, a destroyer of reputations. When conflict arose, it was often the poet, not the warrior, who delivered the first strike. A biting verse could shame a rival tribe, rekindle an old insult, or immortalize a coward's failure. Likewise, a well-placed compliment could seal peace, secure a marriage, or end a feud. Poetry was how justice was argued and remembered. Because in a world without courts, verses became verdicts. Sul, the quiet power of reconciliation. Sul tribal reconciliation was the most respected outcome of conflict. Even after murder, betrayal, or insult, tribes could come to Sul through blood compensation, diya, public apology, a marriage alliance, hosting the rival group for a season, or simply time and silence, when both sides agreed to never speak of the feud again. The process was deliberate, symbolic, watch closely. And once Sul was achieved, to break it was an unforgivable crime. The guest as judge. In many desert stories, the guest becomes the moral compass. Imagine two men argue over grazing rights, tempers flare. A guest seated at the edge of the tent is asked, "Yadakhilna, what do you think?" The guest's word carries weight because he is seen as detached from the conflict, bound by honor not to lie, without bias. This practice served as a primitive but effective court, based not on laws but on shared expectations of fairness. If the guest ruled wisely, he earned eternal hospitality. If not, he would never be welcomed again. The woman who saved a tribe. One oft-retold tale speaks of Layla bint Rashid, a woman known for her sharp tongue and deeper wisdom. In the late 1800s, during a feud between her tribe and a rival clan, both sides had suffered losses. The men prepared for war. But Layla rode alone into the rival camp. She brought no guards, no gifts, no threats, only a small copper bowl filled with milk. She placed it before the enemy sheik and said, "My tribe is like this bowl filled but fragile. Strike it and we all spill. Drink it and we both live." The sheik drank. The war ended. She returned home with no bloodshed, but honor fully intact. What happens when honor fails? There were failures, there were betrayals, there were crimes. But Bedouin society responded with exclusion, not incarceration. A man who cheated in trade might be refused water at every well. A family who lied about lineage might find no suitors for their daughters. A tribe that broke Sul might be cut off from grazing lands. Honor was the only passport in the desert. Lose it and you lost everything. Unresolved thought to end section 2. As the stars rise again over the darkening desert, and you sit in silence watching the fire flicker under the tent, you begin to ask. In a world of complex laws, fast judgments, and distant institutions, what would it mean to return to a justice system built only on memory, trust, and a promise that could cost you everything? The final coals are burning low in the fire pit. The desert is quiet again, less from fatigue, more from discipline. You sit in the majlis, the guest space of the Bedouin tent, where words are carefully chosen and silence is never awkward. Around you are men who say little, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have everything to protect. This final section explores the outcomes of the Bedouin honor system, the continuity it fostered, the endurance it ensured, and the way its principles echo into modern Bedouin life even as states rose, empires collapsed, and borders were drawn across lands that once had none. To survive a landscape that offers no forgiveness, they built a society where every word, every action, and every silence carried weight. The guest becomes the storyteller. When a guest leaves a Bedouin tent, he often carries more than food and blessings. He carries the tribe's reputation. It was understood that a guest would retell his experience, spreading stories of generosity or disgrace across the desert. This became an informal system of record-keeping, one no tribe could afford to ignore. As the saying goes, the guest sees the soul of the tent. This meant that every bowl of milk, every gesture of kindness or hesitation, became a kind of social currency, spent long after the visitor had gone. And so, honor was not a personal possession, it was a shared inheritance, guarded by every action taken beneath the roof of woven hair. Passing down honor, the education of the young. From the time they could walk, Bedouin children were taught the code not through punishment, but through modeling and memory. Boys memorized tribal poems before they learned to write their names. Girls learned how to host guests, mediate arguments, and craft veiled questions that could reveal truth without accusation. Teenagers were sent to distant relatives to learn other camps, exposing them to unfamiliar customs and new reputations. Before marriage, young men were often tested not with tasks of strength, but of judgment and silence. You didn't just inherit your family's land or animals. You inherited its honor score, its debts, its obligations. And if you lost them, you lost your place in the tent. The honor of the poor. Unlike many societies, wealth was not the primary marker of status in Bedouin life. A poor man who kept his word, honored guests, and stood in Nakwa was held in higher esteem than a wealthy man who hoarded, lied, or avoided conflict. There is an old story of a man named Amr who owned nothing but a tent, 2 goats, and a saddle. Yet when a fugitive touched his tent pole, Amr sheltered him for a full week, feeding him, guarding him, and walking him safely to another camp. When the fugitive later became a prominent sheik, he sent Amr a caravan of goods. Amr returned most of it with a note. "I gave you protection, not trade." His name, still spoken today, lives on not because he had much, but because he gave what little he had without hesitation. The betrayal that echoed for generations. No code survives without cracks. One tale tells of a host in the early 1800s who violated letter 1E25 IMA Macron, via H handing over a guest who had sought sanctuary, in exchange for silver and favor with another tribe. His betrayal was not forgotten. His name was never spoken again in tribal poetry. His children were denied marriage. His grave was never marked. And to this day, in a nearby valley, people refer to an empty patch of land as the place where trust died. It is not on a map, but it is remembered. That's how honor works in the desert. Not through edicts, but through stories that never fade. Adapting the code in a changing world. With the arrival of formal governments, borders, and law enforcement in the 20th century, the Bedouin code of honor didn't disappear, it evolved. Sul became part of legal mediation in modern Arab courts. Diya was formalized into civil compensation systems. Elders continued to serve as informal arbitrators, respected even by state officials. In rural areas, police often deferred to tribal sheiks to resolve disputes. Today, a Bedouin man might carry a national ID, serve in the military, or study in a foreign city. But when he returns to his tent, or the house that replaced it, he still understands. You greet a guest before you greet your own family. A promise made is a future held. An insult ignored is stronger than one answered. And sometimes, survival depends not on how loud you are, but how trusted you remain. The tent today. In many parts of the desert, the traditional goat hair tent has been replaced by canvas, concrete, or caravans, yet its structure lives on in custom. Majlis areas in homes still face the door. Meals are still served first to guests. Tribes still meet in seasonal camps to recite lineage and poetry. Feuds still require a poet and a mediator. And the phrase "ana dakhilak" still carries weight in remote villages and urban slums alike. The physical tent may sag or fade, but the code inside it has not collapsed. Final reflection, a code without a court. As you rise from the majlis and leave the tent behind, stars overhead and sand underfoot, you begin to understand something deeper than custom. In a place without walls, books, or badges, the Bedouin built a society where your word was your weapon, and your name was your passport to belonging. And so you ask, what would justice look like if it were not enforced but remembered, not written but spoken, not feared but chosen? Story 6. The Desert and the Gun, Bedouins in the Arab Revolt. It is 1916. The Ottoman Empire is cracking under the strain of global war. From the western shores of the Red Sea to the interior deserts of Arabia, murmurs of rebellion stir. You are near Wadi Safra between Medina and the Hijaz highlands. The sun bakes the rocks in silence. There is no sound until a cloud of dust rises, and a line of camel-mounted riders appears over a ridge. They carry old rifles, curved swords, and leather water skins. They do not wear uniforms. They do not march in ranks, but they are about to change the balance of the war in the desert. This is not a formal army. This is the Bedouin, irregular force of the Arab revolt. This story is not about political speeches or treaty signings in drawing rooms. It is about men who knew the land better than any map, who fought without rank, and who turned their deep knowledge of desert survival into strategic advantage. The Arab Revolt begins. The Arab Revolt was launched in June 1916, led by Sharif Hussein bin Ali of Mecca and backed by the British. Its purpose: to free Arab lands from Ottoman rule and establish Arab independence. But the revolt was less an army than a collection of alliances. Hashemite nobles from the Hijaz, Bedouin tribes from Nejd, the Hijaz and Transjordan, tribal irregulars from Syria and Iraq, and a few foreign advisors, most notably T.E. Lawrence. The Bedouin made up the backbone of this movement, not in numbers, but in mobility, knowledge, and tactical unpredictability. Why the Bedouin joined? Motivations were complex. Many tribes resented Ottoman interference, especially conscription and taxation. Some had long-standing feuds with Ottoman-aligned tribes. Others were swayed by religious argument or promises of Arab self-rule. And for many it was practical. The revolt offered supplies, loot from Ottoman posts, and the chance to shape the post-war future. But most of all, the Bedouins saw opportunity. They had survived countless empires before, and now they would outlast another. Fighting without a front. The Bedouin style of warfare was alien to European armies. No fixed lines. No supply depots. No trenches or uniforms. Instead, speed, surprise, terrain, and total silence until the moment of attack. A typical Bedouin raid involved traveling at night under moonlight, guided by stars, approaching on foot or camel in small groups, attacking rail lines, supply depots, or communication outposts, dispersing immediately before reinforcements could arrive. Then they vanished. To the Ottomans, it was terrorism. To the Bedouin, it was survival made political. The Hijaz Railway, lifeline turned target. One of the central Ottoman supply lines, the Hijaz Railway, ran from Damascus to Medina. It was essential for moving troops, food, and weapons to remote outposts. It became the primary target of the revolt. Bedouin fighters, often with British explosives and guidance, blew up tracks, derailed trains, and sabotaged water stations. They didn't just destroy the railway, they made it unreliable. The Bedouin weren't trying to capture territory. They were trying to deny the enemy freedom of movement, a principle older than any military doctrine. T.E. Lawrence and the Desert Tactic. Lawrence of Arabia understood the power of the Bedouin. He wrote, "The Bedouin could move where no army could move. He could vanish where no pursuit could follow." He learned from them how to ride without raising dust, how to read camel droppings to estimate the size and timing of enemy movements, how to ration water down to the last drop, how to turn silence into strategy. But he was not their leader. At best, he was a bridge between British plans and Bedouin reality. And the reality was simple. You don't command the desert, you collaborate with it. Swords and guns, old meets new. Bedouin fighters carried an odd mix of weapons. Long-barrel rifles from British and Ottoman sources. Mauser bolt actions, often handed down or looted. Jambias and khanjars, curved blades used in close combat or as symbols of status. Homemade explosives, taught by British advisors. They had no formal training, but they had something else. Incredible accuracy at long distances, a skill developed from hunting, ability to shoot and relocate within seconds, unrivaled knowledge of cover, wind, and heat. One British officer remarked, "They shoot like poets, sparse, elegant, and always at the right time. Victories that looked like escapes." In most wars, a battle is judged by who holds the field at the end. But in the desert, holding the field means being exposed. So the Bedouin didn't stay. They struck, took what they needed, freed captives, destroyed infrastructure, and then melted into the dunes. To Western eyes, this looked like retreat. To the Bedouin, it was the final stroke in a complete success. A leader from the tents, Auda Abu Tayi. Among the many Bedouin leaders in the Arab revolt, Auda Abu Tayi of the Hawaitat tribe stood out. Auda was fiercely independent, charismatic, renowned for generosity and brutal honesty, feared even by his allies. He commanded deep loyalty from his fighters and proved critical in the attack on Aqaba, where a combined Bedouin-British force took the port from the Ottomans in a daring desert maneuver. Auda's fame spread beyond Arabia, but he remained, at heart, a man of the tent, distrustful of both empires and bureaucracies. He joined the revolt not for flags or politics, but for tribal autonomy and personal honor. Unresolved thought to end Section 1. As the riders vanish into the heat haze horizon, and the echoes of gunfire fade into the silence of sand and stone, you begin to wonder. When the war ends, and the enemy is gone, how does a people who never needed a government choose what to do with a revolution? The war continues, but the front lines are shifting, not in the neat, trench-drawn maps of Europe, but in the dust-strewn margins of the Arabian Peninsula. It is 1917. The Ottomans are retreating south. Medina is under siege. British officers are scattered among tribal allies. And the Bedouin, they are everywhere and nowhere. They raid and vanish. They guide and withdraw. They align temporarily and resist permanently. This is not their war, but it is happening on their terms. In this section, we explore the middle period of the Arab Revolt, when Bedouin fighters reached the height of their influence, even as the seeds of post-war disappointment were quietly sown. It is the story of triumph, tactical brilliance, and the beginning of deep mistrust. The road to Aqaba, the attack no one expected. The port city of Aqaba was seen as untouchable, defended by Ottoman guns facing the sea. But the Bedouin didn't come from the sea. They came from the desert. In July 1917, T.E. Lawrence, alongside Auda Abu Tayi and tribal fighters from the Hawaitat, Bani Sakher, and other groups, marched across brutal desert terrain to strike Aqaba from behind. They crossed the Wadi Sirhan, a treacherous corridor of heat and mirage, the Hamad Plateau, where water holes are separated by days of emptiness, lands without roads, supply lines, or shade. They lost animals, nearly died of thirst, and ran low on ammunition. But they arrived, and when they attacked Aqaba, they met little resistance. The Ottomans had prepared for ships, not camels. Victory without a flag. After the fall of Aqaba, Bedouin fighters stood over captured cannons and broken crates of ammunition. Some took rifles, others took blankets. A few walked away without touching anything. There was no flag-raising ceremony, no parades. The concept of liberated territory meant little to them. They didn't want to govern Aqaba. They wanted access to trade routes, freedom of movement, protection of their grazing lands. And in their minds, the war was a means, not a mission. The Bedouin view of allies. The British and French had entered the war with maps, treaties, and visions of post-war governance. The Bedouin entered with customs, revenge scores, and shifting alliances. This led to mutual frustration. British officers wanted consistency. Bedouin leaders expected negotiation every time. Europeans wanted loyalty to abstract ideals. Bedouins sought respect for tribal autonomy. One British captain reportedly asked a sheik, "Why do you keep changing sides?" The sheik replied, "Why do you keep pretending you understand the desert?" Gold coins and the price of participation. To sustain the Arab revolt, the British paid tribal fighters in gold, a decision that both empowered and complicated the movement. Tribes joined raids in exchange for coin. Payments were negotiated per man, per day. Loyalty shifted with the price of silver in nearby towns. Some tribes fought not for the revolt, but for retribution against Ottoman-aligned rivals. Critics later called this mercenary warfare. But to the Bedouin, it was a contract, a temporary exchange of service, not a declaration of loyalty. In the tribal view, obligation ends when the agreement ends. The fall of the railway. Throughout 1917 and 1918, Bedouin fighters increased pressure on the Hijaz Railway, the Ottoman lifeline. Key actions included blowing up bridges using British dynamite, mining tunnels and culverts, ambushing isolated trains and capturing supplies, attacking repair crews, making the railway increasingly unsustainable. But there was an unspoken agreement. The line south of Medina was targeted, never the sacred city itself. Though engaged in warfare, Bedouin fighters respected the sanctity of holy sites. This line between combat and desecration was never crossed. New leaders, old realities. As the Arab revolt gained attention, Sharif Faisal, son of Hussein, emerged as its political head, educated, articulate, and ambitious. But his army remained tribal at its core. He spoke in Cairo and Paris. The Bedouins sat under acacia trees and debated poetry. He negotiated futures with empires. They argued over grazing rights with rival clans. The contradiction grew. The revolt was moving outward, but its strength remained rooted in local, pre-modern loyalty. And many of the tribes knew. Empires may change, desert rules do not. The seeds of suspicion. By late 1917, rumors began to spread that the British had secret agreements with the French, that promises of Arab independence were not genuine, that after the war, the tribes might be pushed aside once again. These weren't just suspicions. They were memories. The Bedouin had seen empires come and go, Ottomans, Egyptians, even Crusaders. Each promised partnership. Each brought taxes, soldiers, and law. So the tribal sheiks listened politely to their allies and quietly began preparing for what might come after the war was won. Unresolved thought to end Section 2. As the smoke of another derailed train curls into the desert sky and the fighters ride off, leaving no camp, no flag, no headquarters behind, you begin to wonder. If the Bedouin helped win a war without wanting to rule, what becomes of a revolution once the dust settles and the desert has moved on? It is late 1918. The Ottoman Empire is collapsing. Damascus has fallen. British troops are pouring into the Levant. Sharif Faisal enters the city, hailed by some as a liberator, by others as a political experiment. Around him are diplomats, officers, and new flags. But the Bedouin are absent. They are not at the negotiating tables. They are not writing proclamations. They have returned to their camps, their grazing routes, their tribal councils. Their war is over. This final section of the story traces the end of the Arab revolt through Bedouin eyes, the hollow victory, the unmet promises, and the enduring memory of what was fought for and what was lost. After the guns fell silent, when the dust settled, many Bedouin returned home. Some brought back new rifles, unfamiliar currencies, and stories of cities they had never known before. Others brought scars visible, and not from battles fought in foreign tongues. A few gained reputation and allies. Most gained little, if anything. The campfires that once burned near railways now flickered beside old wells. The tribal elders resumed their place, and the desert resumed its rhythm. But something had shifted, not in the land, but in the space beyond it. The betrayal that arrived in envelopes. The Bedouin had fought with the understanding, sometimes vague, sometimes explicit, that an independent Arab state would emerge after the war. But in 1916, even as the revolt was beginning, Britain and France had signed the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing the Ottoman Arab provinces between them. France would control Syria and Lebanon. Britain would control Iraq and Palestine. No independent Arab state was ever seriously planned. The Bedouin did not learn of this betrayal from declarations. They learned it when foreign soldiers returned, this time not as allies, but as occupiers. Faisal's kingdom, brief as a mirage. Sharif Faisal, the Hashemite prince and symbolic head of the revolt, was installed as king in Damascus in 1920. But the kingdom lasted only a few months before the French removed him by force. To many Bedouin tribes, this confirmed what they had suspected. The paper lies, the horse does not. Faisal later became king of Iraq under British supervision, a bitter reward for a man who once hoped to rule an independent Arab world. And for the tribes who had fought under his banners, it was clear. They had helped remove one empire, only to see two others rise in its place. From freedom to borders, one of the most profound changes came not through war but through maps. Borders were drawn where no lines had ever existed. Tribes found themselves suddenly foreign on lands they had always roamed. Traditional grazing paths now crossed British mandates, French protectorates, or new monarchies. Movement became regulated. Names were recorded. Weapons were restricted. To many Bedouin, this was not civilization. It was a net. One old man was quoted as saying, "When the Turks ruled, we fought them and they left us. Now they come with pens and we are never free again." Memory as resistance. Despite the political outcome, the Arab revolt remained alive in poetry and memory. Songs were composed about the raid on Aqaba, the sabotage of the railway, Ata Abutay's bold speeches, the day Medina wept as the train stopped running. But these stories were not triumphalist. They were often tinged with irony, even regret. One verse, translated roughly from the Najdi dialect, said, "We chased the wind with fire in hand, and found the flame burned back the sand." In Bedouin tradition, remembering is more important than justice. To remember is to keep the soul of the story alive. Ata Abutay's silence. Ata, the famed tribal leader of the Hawaitat, returned to his tent. He refused most political roles offered to him. He was quoted as saying, "I rode for the Hawaitat, not for kings." He rejected titles, refused money, lived and died in the desert. Some admired him for this, others found his withdrawal strange. But to Ata, the revolt had always been personal, not about nations, but about dignity. When it ended without dignity, he simply stepped away. Legacy in the dust. The Arab revolt, as remembered in most history books, centers on flags, treaties, and foreign policy. But for the Bedouin, its legacy was different. They remember the nights before the raid, when silence was more powerful than speeches. The wells shared with strangers. The songs composed beside train wrecks. The glaring heat of the midday raid, when time itself seemed to bend. And the strange moment when the empires thanked them and left them behind. The guns that rusted, the tents that remained. After the war, many Bedouin tribes buried their rifles under sand, to be used only if needed again. Some were handed to grandchildren, more as relics than tools. But the tents remained. So did the honor codes, the tribal feuds and friendships. the rhythms of migration, the poetry of resistance, the memory of a war that passed through but did not change them. Because for the Bedouin, history is not something you read in a book. It is something you carry, like water carefully daily in silence. Final reflection, revolt without a reward. So you stand on the remnants of the Hijaz Railway, the tracks now rusted, the trains long gone. The desert reclaims what was laid upon it. You ask yourself, what is the value of victory if you were never asking for power to begin with, only the right to be left alone? Story 7. Living Wind: How Nomads Track Time Without Clocks. Time flows differently in the desert. You are not governed by bells, nor do you glance at watches. There are no towers to mark the hour, and the sun seems to hang in the sky with endless patience. Yet somehow, life moves with precise rhythm. The herds are watered, journeys begin and end, marriages are timed to seasons, and stories begin just as the night wind changes. This is a world without clocks, but not without timekeeping. In this story, we examine how Bedouin and nomadic societies across the Middle East and North Africa understood and measured time. We explore how they used the stars, shadows, wind, plants, animal behavior, and instinct to move through their days and years. It is a tale not of calendars, but of the quiet attention that makes survival possible in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Time without tools. The Bedouin had no clocks, no hourglasses, no sundials carved into stone. What they had was more ancient. The sun's arc, known to every shepherd. The moon's cycle, used to track the months. The stars, which did not just guide direction, but told when to migrate, when to plant, and when to expect the rains. And perhaps most impressively, they had a sense of time woven into memory and song. Time was not counted. It was felt. The day begins without an alarm. The beginning of a Bedouin day was not marked by a chime or a bell. Instead, it started with the faint chirping of desert birds, the particular color of light that appeared before dawn, slightly pinker, softer, cooler, the cooling of sand under the feet of camels, who began to stir when the temperature dropped just enough, the smell of dew mixed with dry grass. These were not metaphors. They were actual signals learned through repetition. One old nomad once said, "I know the day is ready when my hand casts a shadow that looks like a snake." No one had to ask what time it was. They could see it on the skin of the world. The stars, calendar, clock, and compass. For desert dwellers, the stars were not just beautiful, they were functional. They used stars for night navigation. Certain constellations were always visible at specific times of year. Seasonal timing. The appearance of particular stars told them when winter was ending or summer was near. Weather prediction. The brightness or haze around stars was sometimes used to predict rain or dryness. The Pleiades, a small star cluster known as Al-Thuriya in Arabic, was crucial. Its first appearance on the eastern horizon marked the beginning of the planting season, the start of tribal migrations, the approach of lambing season for goats and sheep. The Bedouin memorized poems that told when Al-Thuriya rose and when it vanished, effectively marking the year. They did not need the Gregorian calendar. They had the stars and verses to hold them in place, dividing the day without numbers. Even without hours and minutes, the Bedouin divided their day into 7 natural parts, each marked by subtle changes in the environment. Al-Sub, dawn, the time before sunrise when prayer begins. Al-Shuruq, sunrise, when the horizon glows and heat is still distant. Al-Duha, mid-morning, when shadows shorten, ideal for breaking camp. Al-Zuhr, midday, when heat peaks and work slows. Al-Asr, afternoon, when shadows lengthen again. Al-Maghrib, sunset, when the first cool breeze returns. Al-Isha, night, when stars dominate and stories begin. Children learned this rhythm by living it, not being told it. A camel driver didn't ask, "Is it 3 p.m.?" he said. "The sun is sitting on the edge of the goat pen." And everyone knew what that meant. Animal clocks. Herd animals served as natural timekeepers. Goats bleated more just before dusk, anticipating the cooler air. Camels shifted their weight and began to rise at dawn. Sheep moved in certain patterns depending on the hour's temperature. Birds changed their calls according to sunlight. A shepherd could say with confidence, "The ewes have begun to lie in the shadow of the tent. Soon, it will be the duha." The body language of animals, honed by centuries of adaptation, was a more reliable clock than any man-made device. Seasons by the wind. Desert seasons are subtle. They don't begin with leaves falling or snowflakes. Instead, Bedouin track seasons by wind. The al-Bari, a dry, strong wind from the north, signaled the end of winter. The Suhili, warm, southern winds in late summer, were feared for carrying sandstorms and illness. The Shamal, frequent in June and July, stirred up the desert, marking the need to camp near water. A sudden drop in wind, called al-Ra, was a sign to begin packing. The air would soon change. Winds told stories. They carried news of distant storms, sent from other camps, the approach of strangers. They were spoken about like people. The wind today is stubborn, like a guest who has overstayed. Songs and memory as temporal anchors. Before writing, oral memory was the archive. Tribes passed time not by counting, but by naming events. This happened in the year of the locusts. That storm came when Khalid was still a child. We moved north the year the well at Al-Ula went dry. Songs embedded timing within verses. When the moon was sharp as a blade, we left Wadi Rum. When the stars kissed the horizon, we turned east. When the camels wept and the sand was cool, we knew the rains were near. Poetry was more than art, it was a clock wrapped in metaphor. Unresolved thought to end section 1. As the sun dips behind a hill of sand and the stars begin to take their place in the night sky, you sit in silence. No ticking clock, no blinking lights, just the slow shift of light, wind, and breath. And you wonder, in a world where we measure time in seconds, what do we lose when we no longer know how it feels? In cities, the year is divided by school semesters, tax forms, retail sales, and fiscal quarters. But in the open lands of Arabia, the Sahara, and the Levant, the year is still remembered in the language of silence, wind, and return. This section takes you deeper into nomadic perceptions of time on a yearly scale, how the passage of seasons was mapped not by numbers, but by events, migrations, flowers, and even the taste of the air. It's not just about what came next, it's about what should come next and what it means when it doesn't. Seasonal time without a calendar. Most nomadic groups didn't divide the year by months in the Gregorian sense. Instead, they broke the year into recognizable, experiential segments. Al-Rabi, the spring. Time of grazing, birthing of animals. Associated with renewal and hospitality. Herbs like kusama, wild lavender, and myrrh bitter herbs bloom. Camels begin producing milk in greater quantities. Al-Saif, the summer. Time of retreat. Camps move closer to oases or highlands. Days spent in shade, movement at night. Associated with survival and patience. Al-Kharif, the autumn. A period of transition when winds shift. Often a time for trade journeys before winter sets in. Known for the movement of flocks. Al-Shita, the winter. Time of rain, Shita, or in some areas cold desert winds. Period of storytelling, staying close to the hearth. Also when settled tribes would produce woven goods, mend tools, prepare for next migration. These were not measured by exact dates. Instead, the scent of the air, the direction of cloud movement, and the behavior of ants and birds marked the transitions. the nomadic calendar of events. A tribe might say, "We last passed this way 3 rains ago." The market at Tabuk will be held when the rams shed their coats. It is the season when the red ants leave their nests at dusk. The lambing began the same week the northern star bowed lowest. These weren't poetic flourishes. They were observable, dependable, and widely understood time markers. Over time, these moments became names in themselves, a living calendar, based on natural events and confirmed by collective memory. The role of elders as timekeepers. In any Bedouin camp, elders served as the clocks of the community. They remembered how long ago a war began, when the last great drought occurred, the year when a beloved sheik died, when the stars failed to appear due to dust storms, and how long the hunger lasted afterward. Elders measured time by tragedy and triumph, not digits. Their memory was infallible in context, not because they knew the date, but because they remembered everything around it. An elder might say, "It was the year your uncle broke his leg, the same year the locusts came." And no one would question it, because everyone remembered the locusts. Intergenerational marking of time. The passage of time was also tethered to people. A story might begin. This happened when your grandfather still carried water for the goats. In this way, personal growth and aging were used as markers. A girl's first weaving. A boy's first camel ride. A man's first solo journey to market town. A woman's first storytelling circle as elder. Time was remembered by life events, rather than external markers. There was no May 15, 1872. There was only the spring we stayed in Wadi al-Kubar when the figs were still green. Moon phases and practical cycles. While the sun ruled the day, the moon ruled the month. Many Bedouin used lunar months for determining fasting or feasting periods, tracking agricultural moon phases for tribes with semi-settled habits, organizing rituals, marriages, funerals, weaning of animals. The new moon was often a quiet time, restful, introspective. The full moon meant night travel was safest, and thus was favored for long-distance journeys or trade. Some tribes even timed storytelling gatherings to coincide with waxing moons, when light would last longer and voices could carry in the clear night air. Tracking time by sound and smell. Modern life separates time from the senses, but desert life sharpened auditory and olfactory awareness to track time. The call of geckos in spring evenings marked the warming air. The buzzing of insects grew louder and more erratic just before sandstorms. The smell of wet rock indicated the first rains of winter. The absence of certain sounds, like the silence of birds, was a time marker of its own. One elder was once quoted saying, "I knew it was the season to move when the smoke from our fire smelled like burnt feathers instead of wood." To many, this might sound poetic. To the Bedouin, it was practical knowledge refined over generations. Trade, pilgrimage, and external time pressure. The Hajj pilgrimage, annual markets, and changing political structures introduced external calendars to Bedouin life. While these events were welcomed and participated in, the tribal worldview adapted, but did not fully conform. A tribe might plan for the Hajj not by saying "in 3 months," but when the southern wind begins to wake early and the moon sits above the well at Bur Fatal, we'll prepare. Even as they engaged with urban time, they translated it into familiar, land-rooted markers. Time was not resisted, but it was reinterpreted not to rebel, but to remain rooted in the rhythms of nature. Unresolved thought to end section 2. As you sit at the edge of a seasonal camp, watching the fire cast long shadows against a rock face streaked with ancient soot, you realize these people do not escape time, they simply listen to it more closely. And you ask yourself, If we lost all our clocks tomorrow, would we know how to feel the year move? You wake to the sound of wind brushing across canvas. The air is cool. A dog barks once in the distance and goes silent. Someone is boiling water for coffee. You do not need a clock to know it is dawn. This final section explores how nomadic understandings of time shaped identity, relationships, and legacy. For the Bedouin and other desert peoples, time is not just marked by the environment, it is experienced through presence, memory, and movement. There is no rush in this world, but everything happens exactly when it should. Time as an act of listening. In modern life, time is imposed. Deadlines, alarms, schedules. In the nomadic life, time is something you join. Bedouin learn to read time, the way others might read a face through. The texture of the wind, the tilt of a star, the reluctance of a goat to move toward pasture, the tone of silence between sounds. A respected guide once said, "If you are still, the time will speak to you." There is no need to control time when you trust it will arrive. Time measured by relationship, not speed. In Bedouin culture, how long something takes is not as important as how well it is done or how respectfully it is shared. You do not measure a visit by the hour, you measure it by how many cups of coffee were offered, how long the guest lingered after the final sip, whether or not a story was told before departure. A short journey may become long if a caravan member grows ill. A long journey may feel brief if marked by beauty or song. Time is not a commodity. It is a shared rhythm. Death is a calendar mark. Without fixed calendars, major losses, deaths of tribal elders, beloved animals, or symbolic events often became anchors in time. For example, that was 3 winters after Sheikh Ibrahim died. It was during the 2nd year after the red stallion passed. We had not yet mourned Salma when the rains failed. These markers weren't morbid. They were a way of honoring the dead by keeping them alive in speech, linking the flow of time to memory rather than digits. Death didn't stop time. It entered it. Time is a circle, not a line. In many desert cultures, time is viewed as cyclical, not linear. The seasons return. The stars cycle. The paths of migration repeat. Elders are remembered by watching their grandchildren take the same walks. Stories are told not to document the past, but to live it again. This circular view prevents urgency. If what was will come again, there is no panic. There is preparation, not fear. A storm will return, so will the spring. Survival through rhythmic living. Living with time, not against it, has survival value. Rushing in the desert can be deadly. Walk too early and you collapse from heat. Camp too late and your animals suffer. Leave during a windy moon and your path may vanish. Timing was not philosophical. It was practical knowledge honed to the second. A goat herder once said, "You can't beat the sun, so walk with it instead." Those who survived longest were not the fastest, but the most attuned to the rhythm of their surroundings. The disruption of mechanical time. With the arrival of colonial forces, trade caravans, and oil interests, watches and clocks began to appear in desert society. They were seen as useful, but also untrustworthy. Clocks worked in offices, but in the field, a dying camel, a rising wind, or a sick child dictated real time. Mechanical time could not account for the need to pause for storytelling. A sudden desert sickness. The moment when a hawk circled overhead, and the group stopped to interpret its sign. In many tribes, even after adopting watches, elders continued to rely on the old ways, because the land kept better time than any gear wheel. Echoes in modern Bedouin communities. Today, many Bedouin have relocated, partially or fully, to cities or settlements. Children go to schools, phones track the hour, Clocks are now in homes. Yet among elders and even younger storytellers, there remains a sense of desert time. A tendency to tell stories in seasonal, not chronological order. A preference for shared meals without deadlines. An instinct to watch the sky before checking a weather app. Some still track days by sunlight on a doorway, or how long coffee takes to boil over fire. Desert time, even when forgotten, lingers like the wind it always returns. Final reflection: what if time isn't meant to be measured? In the quiet of the desert, surrounded by rocks that have waited millennia, by stars that arc overhead in perfect rhythm, and by people who still measure their days in footsteps and winds, you ask yourself, what if the most meaningful time is not counted but remembered, not measured but felt? And in that silence, time passes not in seconds but in presence. Story 8. The weavers of survival, textiles, tents, and the genius of nomadic craft. In the stillness of the desert, a tent stands not fixed like a house, but breathing with the wind. It is not just a roof. It is a system of survival, engineered from memory, crafted by hand, and passed down through generations. This story explores the ingenious world of Bedouin and nomadic textile craft, how tents were made, how looms were portable, how thread could mean life or death, and how weaving wasn't just art, it was infrastructure, identity, and history woven into form. You'll find no grand palaces here, no towering stone buildings, but you'll find architecture of the most adaptable kind, built not to resist nature, but to live within it. A tent, but not a home in the Western sense. A nomadic tent known as a beit sha'ar in Arabic, meaning house of hair, was more than a structure. It was a shelter against wind, dust, sun, and rain. A movable house that could be packed in hours. A symbol of tribe and lineage. A center for hospitality, ritual, song, and governance. And above all, a product of weaving from camel hair, goat wool, sheep's fleece. There were no blueprints, only memory. And the materials, grown, shorn, spun, and dyed by the same hands that raised the tents. The tent as technology. At first glance, a Bedouin tent seems simple, but every part of it serves a purpose. Goat or camel hair fibers were chosen for their durability and ability to swell slightly in humidity, creating rain-resistant seams. The weave was loose enough to allow hot air to escape and tight enough to block sunlight. The black color absorbed just enough morning warmth, but did not overheat during midday. The design allowed for easy division between public and private spaces, crucial for both hospitality and modesty. Tent size was determined by social standing, number of family members, and available materials. There was no waste. Every part of the tent could be repaired, rewoven, or replaced. The weavers, women as architects. The tent was a woman's domain, not only as a space, but as a creation. Women carded, spun, dyed, and wove the strips that would be sewn into full tent coverings. The loom, known as a nawl, was often nothing more than 2 pegs and a bar, portable, efficient, and powered by memory. Weaving began early in life and was taught alongside genealogy, poetry, and etiquette. A woman's weaving skill was a marker of wisdom, capability, and grace. Marriage often included hand-woven textiles as part of the dowry, not just decoration, but actual pieces of infrastructure. Tent strips, rugs, saddle blankets. In weaving, women shaped the landscape of survival. Color, pattern, and symbol. Though many nomadic tents were primarily black or dark brown, the textiles inside rugs, camel bags, saddle covers often bore bold red, white, and natural hues. Patterns were not decorative alone, they carried meaning. Triangles for protection. Chevron stripes to indicate lineage or region. Geometric motifs that referenced myth, history, or religious belief. These patterns were not copied from books. They were carried in the minds of weavers, passed from mother to daughter. And in some tribes, no two rugs were ever exactly alike. The rug as room, map, and archive. Inside the tent, woven rugs served many roles. Flooring to keep the sand at bay. Seating with orientation toward the entrance and center. Prayer mats carefully positioned. Storyboard, where guests and family gathered to recite poetry or news. Insulation, rolled or layered depending on season. And in many cases, the first textile a child crawled upon. A guest might be offered a particular rug to sit on not just for comfort, but as a signal of honor and placement. The tent had no walls, but the arrangement of rugs and cushions told you everything. Thread and survival. Weaving was not just cultural, it was critical to survival. A desert windstorm could rip canvas. A woven tent could be repaired overnight. A camel saddle might fray during travel. A replacement could be woven from fibers carried inside a pouch and completed by the next rest stop. Women often spun while walking, never wasting time. Even strands left from carding could be used for cords, ties, or slings. Every piece of fabric, even worn-out ones, could become a patch, a rein, a child's toy, or binding for wounds. Thread was currency, utility, and comfort, and its use told you how well a family was managing the year. Unresolved thought to end section 1. As night falls and the woven flap of a goat hair tent is pulled down to block the wind, you listen to the creak of ropes, the sigh of rugs beneath you, and the quiet weaving of thread by firelight. You begin to wonder, what happens to a people when their architecture is no longer carried on their backs, but left behind in museums and books? You wake beneath woven black wool, the morning wind slipping between seams that were tightened just days ago. The fire is cold. The tent is quiet. Somewhere nearby, a woman is tightening the ropes, humming as she works. This section continues our exploration of nomadic weaving not as a craft, but as a way of life management. Here, we examine the broader textile ecosystem, how tools were made portable, how weaving governed trade, how looms were part of migration routes, and how fibers became the backbone of mobile economies. The loom that travels. The Bedouin loom was simple, ingenious, and mobile. Known as a horizontal ground loom, it was built from 2 wooden pegs, easily hammered into sand or soil. Strung with warp threads stretched out on the ground. Controlled with simple wooden sticks or bones for spacing and beater tools. Compact enough to fold up and travel within a single camel's load. It allowed a weaver to pause mid-weft, roll up the half-woven textile, and continue a week later at a different camp. Nothing was left behind. Even the loom's pieces could become firewood, tent pegs, or animal restraints in emergencies. From fiber to fabric, the process. Shearing, done by hand seasonally. Camels, goats, and sheep provided different grades of fiber. Each type served different purposes: camel for durability, goat for warmth, sheep for softness. Carding. The raw fiber was teased apart using hands, sticks, or brushes made from thorns. Cleaned of debris and prepared for spinning. Spinning. A drop spindle was used, a weighted stick with twine wrapped in practiced hands. Often done while walking, herding, or even during conversations. Dyeing. Most fabrics remained undyed, but when color was added, it came from local plants. Henna for red tones. Indigo for deep blues. Pomegranate peel or iron-rich muds for brown and gray hues. Natural dyes gave muted, earthy tones that blended with the desert. Weaving. Done mostly by women, often collaboratively, in rhythmic silence or during storytelling sessions. Weaving was not rushed. It aligned with the pace of daily life and the demands of migration. Tools made from nothing. A nomadic weaver's toolkit was humble and efficient. spindles carved from discarded bones, dye vats made from clay or hollowed gourds, shuttles fashioned from twigs or rolled cloth, needles from thorn or fishbone. When something broke, it was remade from what was nearby, nothing imported, nothing wasted. This made weaving not only practical, but resilient. It could survive any hardship, resume after any delay, and serve any purpose. Textiles as currency. In a land without banks or coinage for many, textiles became trade goods. A well-made camel saddlecloth could be traded for food, tools, or even livestock. Decorative bags like curge were used to transport goods and could be exchanged in markets. Woven strips became dowry items or tribal offerings in times of alliance making. Unlike gold, which had to be protected and could not feed or clothe you, textiles were utility assets. You could use them or sell them, often at the same time. Their value was not in ornamentation, but endurance. Encoded in thread, stories, status, and skill. Weaving also served non-verbal communication. Patterns told other tribes your clan or region. Certain color combinations indicated marital status or seniority. Mistakes were rare and, if present, intentional to avoid the evil eye of perfection. Weaving styles were so distinct that, even centuries later, textile historians can often identify the exact tribe from a single tent panel fragment. Thread held identity. To unroll a carpet was to unroll a family's biography. Adaptability in weaving. The nomadic textile ecosystem adapted constantly. In drought, thinner weave saved fiber. During long migrations, more rugs were tied onto camels to distribute weight. If a woman fell ill or died, her sisters or daughters would finish her work, sometimes inserting symbolic patterns to mark the moment. This adaptability made textiles the most sustainable form of infrastructure in desert life. They were never finished, always ready to shift, stretch, or be reworked. Textiles and ritual. Many important life events were surrounded by textiles. Births, infants swaddled in inherited wool strips believed to carry luck. Weddings, brides gifted with camel bags embroidered by grandmothers. Deaths, rugs were sometimes buried with the deceased or repurposed in honor. Prayers, special mats, not just any rug faced toward Mecca. Each woven object had a lineage, and often a whispered prayer woven into its final rows. Unresolved thought to end section 2. As the sun lowers behind a line of camels, and a woman gathers her loom pegs for the journey tomorrow, the sand catches the edge of her weave and briefly lifts it like a flag. And you wonder, when a culture's architecture is made to move, what anchors its memory to place? The fire is low now, its smoke rising in slow spirals above the sand. Beneath your hand, a coarse rug warms your skin. Around you, the tent breathes softly in the night wind, ropes creaking, shadows swaying. This final section draws together the story of textile survival among nomadic peoples. Here we explore how these woven creations built of animal hair, whether labor and love, outlasted kingdoms, wars, and even the migrations that once gave them life. What happens when the tents are rolled for the last time? What is remembered and what fades? Weaving was never just about shelter. It was about permanence in impermanence. When movement ceases. By the mid-20th century, the nomadic lifestyle that had shaped Bedouin and desert tribes for centuries began to change. Borders were drawn, nomadic movement was restricted. Sedentarization programs offered homes in towns and incentives to stay. Water wells were drilled by governments, reducing the need for seasonal migration. Plastic tarps and metal roofing replaced tents in many areas. The black goat hair tents, once seen across the steppe and desert, became rarer. So did the sound of drop spindles and the slow, careful beat of hand looms pressed into sand. But the knowledge remained. sometimes in silence. Memory in the Weft. Even when people no longer lived nomadically, the textiles continued. Woven rugs were displayed in homes. Grandmothers taught spinning on rooftops. Tent strips were preserved and handed down, even if never again used for shelter. Symbols were copied onto modern fabrics, digitally printed, machine-made, but ancestrally true. Some tribes made a point to weave one tent section each year, not out of necessity, but out of respect. A kind of textile remembrance, a ritual that preserved knowledge even as the world moved on. Weaving and the sacred. Certain rugs and cloths were never traded, even in hardship. They were used only during weddings, draped behind the bride and groom, laid out when guests of high honor arrived, placed in the path of religious processions, or never removed from the tent, even if the rest was taken down. These textiles were considered living things, imbued with baraka blessing. To tear or discard them was unthinkable. To this day, in some remote villages, a child is still rocked to sleep in a cradle lined with a grandmother's weaving. Museums, markets, and misplacement. As interest in tribal or ethnic art grew in the 20th century, museum collectors, tourists, and traders began seeking out Bedouin and nomadic textiles. Tent panels were cut into wall hangings. Camel bags were sold in markets as purses. Ceremonial rugs were mislabeled and misused. Patterns once rich with meaning were reproduced without knowledge of their origin. For some, this was heartbreaking. For others, it was a way to keep the legacy alive, even in altered form. But among weavers and elders, there was always a difference between a rug made for a shop and a rug that remembers the journey. The last tents. Even today, there are places, remote plateaus, desert edges, river valleys where the black tents still rise. Not often, not always for living, sometimes only for weddings or seasonal grazing. But they are still made, still repaired, still recognized. Young women learn to spin from goat hair. Old women pass the loom tools from hand to hand. A few families raise their children under the same woven roofs as their ancestors. And when asked, why do you still do it? The answer is simple. Because it's ours. Woven survival in the modern world. In a time when climate change, migration, and technological upheaval dominate the global conversation, there is renewed interest in the sustainability and genius of nomadic craft. Architects study tent design for passive cooling. Designers explore biofibers and non-industrial dyeing. Anthropologists look to oral transmission of technical skill. And in refugee camps across the world, weaving has returned as therapy, income, and stability. The Bedouin tent, so easily dismissed as outdated, is now seen as a model of environmental harmony and resilience. A living thread. The survival of nomadic textile culture lies not in museums or markets, but in the girl who learns to spin while tending goats. The tent raised once a year to teach children what came before. The rugs that are not sold but used. The rhythmic pull of the loom, remembered even by those who now live in towns. And the silent, stubborn wisdom that sees no shame in mending what others throw away. Final reflection, threads that remember. As the night deepens and the desert cools, you rest on a rug that has traveled more miles than most men. Its edges are worn, its pattern faded, but its story is intact. And you ask, if the house you live in disappears, and only your threadwork remains, what would your cloth say about how you lived?